The air in the octagon tomb hung thick and heavy, a palpable presence that clung to the skin like the sweat of a fevered brow. It was a humidity born not just of the Anatolian summer pressing against the ancient stone, but of centuries of stillness, of secrets held in the dark. Dr. Eris Thorne, his face a mask of scholarly concentration etched with the fatigue of countless hours spent in the closed, dusty confines, knelt beside the hastily erected cordon. Before him, illuminated by the harsh, sterile glare of portable floodlights, lay the unsettling tableau, a skeleton. Or rather, the suggestion of one. The torso, pelvis, and limbs were articulated with a grim fidelity, a testament to a human form long since surrendered to the earth. Yet the neck, where the head should have been, ended in a jagged, abrupt severance. It was a violent punctuation mark in the otherwise quiet narrative of skeletal remains. And then there was the skull. Discovered a mere meter away, nestled amongst the loose scree and desiccated detritus of the tomb's floor, it seemed to mock the skeletal remains it should have joined. It lay on its side, a silent, pale enigma, its jaw slack, its empty sockets staring with an unnerving blankness. The distance, though short, was a chasm. No amount of careful positioning, no subtle shifting of bone against bone could bridge the gap. It was as if the two pieces of a macabre puzzle had been deliberately separated, their intended union forever denied. This was no ordinary burial. The meticulousness of the octagon's construction, the very sanctity of the tomb, argued against accidental disarray. This was a statement, a disruption, a whisper from a past so distant, yet so potent, that it could still disturb the present. The archaeologists, a small, dedicated team drawn from across the globe, exchanged uneasy glances. Each was an expert in their field: osteology, epigraphy, ancient funerary practices. Yet this discovery defied easy categorization. The air vibrated with unspoken questions, each more unsettling than the last. Was this a ritualistic dismemberment? A hasty interment, perhaps in defiance of Roman law? Or something far more sinister, a deliberate act of desecration designed to confound and mislead? The headless skeleton was a ghost of a body, its identity fractured, its story broken before it had even begun to be deciphered. The skull, detached and aloof, seemed to belong to a different narrative altogether, a separate, silent witness to an unknown truth. Dr. Thorne, his gaze fixed on the incongruous juxtaposition of bone, felt a tremor of something beyond academic curiosity. It was the thrill of the unknown, yes, but also a profound sense of unease. The bones, bleached and brittle, were not merely archaeological specimens. They were potent symbols. The disarray of the skeleton, the misplaced skull, these were not simply physical anomalies. They were potent metaphors for the fragmented nature of history itself, for the stories that had been deliberately buried, distorted, or lost to the relentless march of time. The octagon, designed to house and preserve, had instead become a repository of enigma, its silence amplified by the deafening questions it posed. He ran a gloved hand over his chin, the rough stubble, a stark contrast to the smooth coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips. "It's perplexing," he murmured, the word inadequate to capture the depth of the puzzle. Dr. Lena Petrova, a renowned specialist in Hellenistic skeletal remains, had already begun her meticulous preliminary examination, her movements precise and economical. She too was struck by the anomaly. "The articulation of the torso is consistent with a body laid to rest," she observed, her voice low and measured. "But the absence of the skull and its placement, it's highly unusual. There's no sign of significant disturbance that would suggest grave robbers. And the tomb itself, the octagon, is too grand, too deliberately constructed for casual neglect." The humid air seemed to press in, amplifying the soft sounds of their work, the gentle scraping of a brush, the rustle of plastic sheeting, the hushed murmurs of consultation. Each breath seemed to draw in the dust of ages, a reminder of the immense gulf of time separating them from the unknown hands that had placed these bones to rest, or perhaps to remain restless. The tomb, an imposing structure of 8 sides, had been designed for permanence, a monument intended to endure. Yet, within its walls, the ultimate testament to a life, the head that housed the mind, the face that bore the expression, was missing, or at least separated from its natural anchor. Eris looked at the skull again. Its features, though softened by the passage of millennia, still held a certain character. Was it male, female, old, young? Lena would tell him, of course, with the precise language of bone and morphology. But even now, in its silent testimony, there was a sense of individuality, a stark contrast to the anonymous mass of the rest of the skeleton. The more he looked, the more the disjunction felt deliberate, a calculated act of separation. It was as if the tomb was a stage set for a play whose script had been lost, leaving only these enigmatic actors in their dislocated roles. He recalled the preliminary reports that had led them to Ephesus, the whispers of a possible Ptolemaic connection, a forgotten queen, a political exile. These were the threads that had drawn them to this ancient city, to this imposing structure. Now, those whispers seemed to have coalesced into a tangible, albeit deeply disturbing, reality. The octagon tomb, an archaeological marvel in its own right, with its intricate mosaics and sophisticated construction, had yielded more than just architectural grandeur. It had offered a mystery, a profound, visceral puzzle that resonated with the very essence of what they, as historians and archaeologists, sought to uncover, the truth of the past, however fragmented and elusive it might be. The sheer incongruity of the scene was what struck him most profoundly. The anatomical continuity of the headless skeleton spoke of a natural, albeit violent, end. The displaced skull, however, hinted at a narrative that transcended mere mortality, a story woven with intention, with purpose. It was a deliberate act of narrative subversion, a posthumous rebellion against an already fading memory. Who would go to such lengths, and why? The questions multiplied like the echoes in a vast, empty hall, each one demanding an answer that the silent bones refused to give. Eris stood, his joints protesting the long hours of kneeling. He surveyed the octagon, the imposing stone walls, the carefully constructed sarcophagus. It was a place of intended rest, of eternal slumber. Yet, the skeletal remains within whispered of an interrupted peace, of a story deliberately obscured. The humid air, heavy with the scent of dry earth and ancient dust, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to unravel the mystery, to piece together the fragments of a life deliberately fractured. The disarray of the bones, he realized, with a growing sense of certainty, was not a testament to chaos, but to an intricate and deeply unsettling order. The tale of this tomb, like the history it represented, was not a simple chronicle, but a complex tapestry, its threads deliberately tangled, its most vital pieces deliberately misplaced, leaving behind an echo of a forgotten, and perhaps deliberately silenced, voice. The humid air of Ephesus, a city steeped in myth and antiquity, seemed to hold its breath, muffling even the usual drone of cicadas that sang in the sun-baked ruins. Within the octagon, a somber quiet had descended, broken only by the hushed, professional murmurs of the archaeological team. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose life had been dedicated to excavating the buried truths of antiquity, felt the weight of that silence pressing down on him. The discovery was, to put it mildly, confounding. A skeleton, laid out as if for burial, yet undeniably headless, and beside it, a skull, a pale, silent witness, its position jarringly incongruous, a clear rejection of its natural place. This was no simple interment. This was a riddle etched in bone. The skeletal remains themselves told a story of a life lived, then brutally ended. The pelvic structure, the length of the femurs, the configuration of the vertebral column, they spoke of a human form, articulated, once whole. But the neck, where the vital nexus of skull and body should have been, presented a stark, ragged termination. It was a clean break, a severance that suggested a deliberate act, not the slow decay of time or the haphazard disruption of tomb robbers. The bones, aged by centuries, had retained the imprint of violence. This was not a natural repose. It was a violent interruption of rest. Then there was the skull. Found a short distance away, it lay on its side, its cranium tilted as if in a posture of surprise or perhaps defiance. Its empty ocular orbits seemed to gaze out into the dimly lit tomb, a silent interrogator. The distance between the skull and the headless body, though not vast in the grand scheme of an ancient city, was a chasm in the context of a burial. It was too far to be a simple displacement during the initial burial, and too close to be entirely unrelated. The tomb, the octagon, with its sturdy construction and clear funerary purpose, offered no explanation for such a stark separation. It was a carefully constructed edifice designed for preservation, not for the chaotic scattering of remains. Eris knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy that had coursed through him upon first entering the tomb. He examined the ground around the skeletal remains, looking for any sign of disturbance that might explain the anomaly. There were none. The dust lay relatively undisturbed, save for the careful excavations of his team. No evidence of repeated intrusions, no chaotic ransacking that would suggest grave robbers seeking treasure. The tomb had remained, for the most part, a sealed testament to its original purpose. This meant the disarray was, most likely, part of the original deposition. Dr. Lena Petrova, the team's osteoarchaeologist, worked with a focused intensity, her gloved fingers gently brushing away the clinging earth from the bones. "The articulation of the torso is remarkable, Eris," she murmured, her voice a low hum in the hushed space. "It suggests the body was placed here, in this position, before rigor mortis set in. The limbs are relatively aligned, but the cervical vertebrae, they are completely absent. And this skull," she gestured towards it with her brush, "it's not positioned as if it simply rolled off. It's placed." "Placed?" Eris echoed, the word hanging in the air. "Yes, or perhaps dropped, but deliberately separated. There's no evidence of gnawing by animals, no signs of damage that would occur from being dragged or moved by natural forces over centuries. It's as if it was intentionally removed and set aside." The implications were chilling. In a society where the proper burial of the dead, particularly those of status, was paramount, such a deliberate act of separation was deeply disturbing. It spoke of a profound disrespect, or perhaps a symbolic act of immense significance. The octagon itself, a structure of considerable size and architectural sophistication, hinted at a burial of importance. This was not the resting place of a commoner. Eris considered the history of Ephesus, a vibrant Hellenistic city, a crossroads of cultures, a site of immense religious importance, particularly for the cult of Artemis. It had also, in its time, been subject to Roman influence, and later, direct Roman rule. The Ptolemaic dynasty, a fading power in Egypt, had its own intricate entanglements with Rome. Could this tomb, and its perplexing contents, be connected to that tumultuous period? The very idea sent a shiver down his spine, a frisson of academic excitement battling with a primal sense of unease. He looked at the skull again. Its features, though softened by the ravages of time, were distinct. It was the physical embodiment of individuality, the seat of thought, of identity. Its separation from the body was a symbolic severing of that identity, a profound act of dissociation. It was as if the very essence of the person had been deemed separate, or perhaps too dangerous, to remain joined. The humid air seemed to thicken, filled with the ghosts of untold stories. The bones, silent witnesses to a forgotten drama, lay before them, their disarray, a potent metaphor for the fragmented narratives that history so often presented. They were not just archaeological finds, they were the remnants of a life, a death, and perhaps a deliberate attempt to manipulate memory itself. The archaeologists, standing in the dim light of the octagon, felt the immense responsibility of their task. To decipher these whispers from the past, to piece together a story that had been deliberately broken, was a challenge that went beyond mere academic pursuit. It was an attempt to reclaim a lost truth from the very fabric of time, a truth that, even in its skeletal remains, seemed to possess a potent, enduring power. The discovery within the octagon tomb was more than an archaeological anomaly. It was a visceral shock. The headless skeleton, stark and unsettling against the ancient earth, spoke of a brutal finality. But it was the presence of a separate skull, lying near the remains, yet clearly detached, that truly arrested the senses and ignited the intellect. This was not the work of time or nature. This was a deliberate act, a theatrical staging of death that suggested a narrative far more complex than a simple burial. The humid, cloying air of Ephesus seemed to press in, heavy with the weight of centuries and the palpable mystery of these dislocated bones. Dr. Eris Thorne, his brow furrowed in concentration, knelt beside the makeshift barrier cordoning off the site. His gaze, honed by years of deciphering the silent language of the past, was fixed on the incongruous tableau. The torso and limbs of the skeleton lay in a state of relative anatomical integrity, as if a body had been laid to rest with care. Yet, the neck, where the head should have articulated, presented a jagged, abrupt end. It was a severance that screamed of violence, a stark and brutal punctuation mark in the otherwise quiet narrative of skeletal remains. And then, the skull. Discovered a short distance away, it rested on its side, its empty sockets gazing out into the gloom of the tomb with an unnerving stillness. It was a face without a body, a head without a home. The space between the skull and the headless remains was not vast, yet it represented an unbridgeable gulf. No amount of careful repositioning, no gentle nudging of bone against bone could reconcile the two. They were, and remained, separate entities, a macabre puzzle whose pieces refused to fit. The tomb itself offered no solace, no easy explanation. The octagon, a structure of impressive size and deliberate construction, was clearly designed as a place of eternal rest for someone of consequence. Its architecture spoke of permanence, of a desire to preserve and honor. Yet, within its walls, the very integrity of that preservation had been violated in the most profound way. The disarray of the remains was not consistent with the chaotic intrusions of tomb robbers seeking material wealth. There were no signs of widespread disturbance, no scattered artifacts that would indicate a frantic search. The disjunction was too precise, too pointed, to be accidental. Lena Petrova, the team's osteoarchaeologist, her movements economical and precise, worked with a quiet intensity. Her gloved hands carefully brushed away the clinging earth, revealing the delicate structures of bone. "The alignment of the torso is quite good, Eris," she observed, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the charged silence. "It suggests the body was placed here, in this position, shortly after death, before the tissues began to significantly degrade. But the cervical vertebrae, they are completely absent. And this skull," she gestured with her brush, "it's not simply a case of it rolling away. It appears to have been deliberately placed, or at least deposited separately." "Deliberately placed," Eris repeated, the words resonating with a chilling weight. This was not a case of historical happenstance. This was an intentional act, a carefully orchestrated disruption. The implications were profound. In ancient societies, the integrity of the burial rite was paramount. The proper resting place of the head, the seat of the soul and identity, was particularly significant. To separate it from the body was to commit a grave offense, a symbolic act of profound disrespect, or perhaps something far more complex, a ritualistic act, a political statement, or even a desperate measure to conceal identity. He scanned the tomb again, his eyes taking in the cool, smooth stone, the remnants of what might have been decorative elements now lost to time. Who had possessed the authority and the willingness to desecrate a tomb in such a manner? And why? Was it a punishment, a ritual, or a calculated act of obfuscation designed to confuse and mislead future generations? The very presence of the octagon suggested a burial of importance, perhaps royal, or at least of significant social standing. This was not a random act of desecration against a commoner. The skull, in its detached state, seemed to possess a certain agency. Its empty sockets, staring blankly, were more than just anatomical features. They were silent witnesses, their blankness a powerful testament to the unknown. It was the face of a person, distinct and individual, now divorced from the body that had housed it. The separation felt symbolic, a deliberate erasure of connection, a fracturing of identity. It was as if the very essence of the individual had been deemed too dangerous, too significant, to remain whole, even in death. Aris considered the historical context of Ephesus, a city that had witnessed empires rise and fall, a nexus of trade and culture, and a focal point for both Greek and Roman influence. Its history was a complex tapestry woven with threads of power, religion, and shifting political allegiances. Could this tomb, this peculiar arrangement of bones, be a relic of those turbulent times? The whispers of Ptolemaic intrigue, of exiled royalty and Roman ambition that had drawn them to this site now seemed to coalesce around this disturbing discovery. The disarray of the skeletal remains, he mused, was not a testament to chaos, but to a deliberate, almost artistic manipulation. It was a narrative etched in bone, a story of fragmented identity and interrupted peace. The tomb, designed for preservation, had instead become a repository of enigma, its silence amplified by the profound questions the bones posed. The humid air of Ephesus, thick with the scent of dust and time, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to unravel the secrets held within the octagon, secrets that had been deliberately buried, deliberately fractured, and deliberately, disturbingly, left for them to find. The journey into the past, he knew, had just taken a sharp, unsettling turn. The bones were silent, yet they spoke volumes of a story intentionally obscured. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom of the octagon, each a tiny phantom conjured from the disturbed stillness of ages. Eris Thorne watched them, a silent ballet against the backdrop of the headless skeleton and its solitary skull. His mind, however, was no longer solely on the immediate enigma of Ephesus. The discovery, so stark and violent, had begun to resonate with a deeper, more complex narrative that had been the driving force behind their expedition. The dying embers of Ptolemaic Egypt and its inevitable entanglement with the rising might of Rome. The headless corpse, so brutally dissociated, felt less like a singular act of violence and more like a potent metaphor for a dynasty itself, its body politic dismembered, its head lost in a maelstrom of ambition and encroaching foreign power. Ptolemaic Egypt. The very name conjured images of immense wealth, of ancient traditions clashing with Hellenistic sophistication, of a fertile land nourished by the life-giving Nile. But beneath the gilded surface, the dynasty was a house divided, its foundations corroded by infighting, its rulers more adept at intrigue than at effective governance. Alexander the Great's empire had fractured, and in its dissolution, the most glittering shard had fallen to the hands of Ptolemy I Soter, a Macedonian general who had seized Egypt and established a lineage that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. For a time, they had been a force to be reckoned with, patrons of art and science, their capital Alexandria a beacon of Hellenistic culture. Yet, that golden age was a fading memory, a distant echo against the growing roar of Roman legions. The Ptolemies, particularly in their later generations, had become masters of courtly machinations. The royal family was a claustrophobic entity, a gilded cage where siblings married siblings, where power was a poisoned chalice, and where survival often depended on cunning, ruthlessness, and a keen eye for the shifting sands of favor. The constant presence of Rome, first as a distant suitor, then as an increasingly assertive patron, loomed over every decision, every alliance, every betrayal. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, was also a city under a watchful eye, its immense wealth a tempting prize, its strategic importance undeniable. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, viewed Egypt not as an equal, but as a granary, a treasury, and a vital pawn in its ceaseless game of expansion and control. Within this volatile milieu, a figure of particular note, and indeed of particular fascination to Eris, was Arsinoe III. Though her story was not directly inscribed in the bones before him, it was intrinsically linked to the era, to the political currents that had shaped the very world that might have produced such a tomb and such a burial. Arsinoe, sister and wife of Ptolemy IV Philopator, had been a woman of considerable intelligence and ambition, a queen who for a time had wielded significant influence. Her reign, however, was fraught with peril. The court was a den of vipers, populated by eunuchs, sycophants, and ambitious generals, each vying for the king's ear and the reins of power. Ptolemy IV, often depicted as dissolute and weak, had left much of the actual governance to others, creating fertile ground for manipulation and intrigue. The death of Ptolemy IV had plunged the kingdom into an even deeper abyss of uncertainty. Arsinoe, alongside her young son Ptolemy V Epiphanes, had attempted to navigate the treacherous waters of succession, but she found herself facing not only the predatory machinations of the court, but also the ever-present threat of Roman interference. Agathocles, a notoriously corrupt and ambitious minister, had seized control of the regency, effectively sidelining Arsinoe and her son. The queen, once a figure of power, found herself increasingly isolated, her every move watched, her every whisper potentially a death sentence. Aris ran a gloved finger over a fragment of pottery near the skeletal remains, its faded decoration hinting at a time when such artistry was a source of pride, not a forgotten relic. He imagined Arsinoe, perhaps in her palace in Alexandria, surrounded by luxury but living under a perpetual cloud of fear. The political climate she inhabited was one where alliances were as ephemeral as desert mirages, and where betrayal was a common currency. The Ptolemaic court was a place where one's own family could be the most dangerous enemy. Ptolemy IV himself had been notoriously cruel, and Arsinoe had been forced to make difficult choices to secure her own survival and that of her son. The summary provided emphasized the suffocating opulence and constant danger of a court where every whisper can be a death knell. This was the reality that shaped the lives of the Ptolemies in their final century. It was a world of lavish banquets where poison might be served alongside the finest wines. It was a world of whispered plots in darkened corridors, where a misplaced word could lead to exile, imprisonment, or a swift, silent execution. It was a world where loyalty was a rare and precious commodity, constantly tested and easily broken. Aris recalled the accounts of Arsinoe's eventual fate. Under Agathocles' regency, she had been systematically disempowered. The chilling detail was that she was eventually murdered, reportedly poisoned on the orders of Agathocles. The manner of her death, the supposed poisoning, resonated with the underlying sense of insidious danger that permeated the Ptolemaic court. It was a death that was not a dramatic battlefield casualty or a public execution, but a quiet, clandestine act, hidden beneath the veneer of courtly life. And what of the dismemberment, the separated skull? Could such an act, so visceral and symbolic, be connected to the political assassinations and power struggles of that era? In a world where the physical body was often the battleground for political will, where bodies were displayed, mutilated, or their relics scattered to serve as warnings, the deliberate separation of head from body seemed a fittingly brutal expression of power and control. It was a statement that transcended mere death, striking at the very identity and legacy of the deceased. The octagon, Eris mused, while located in Ephesus, a Roman province, could easily have served as a final resting place for someone fleeing the machinations of Alexandria, or perhaps someone whose death had been orchestrated by those still in power there, their final resting place chosen with a deliberate act of posthumous insult or symbolic dismemberment. The Ptolemies, in their decline, were deeply enmeshed with Roman affairs. Roman emissaries were a constant presence in Alexandria, their influence growing with each passing year. Ptolemaic rulers often found themselves forced to appease Roman demands, cede territory, or even engage in costly wars to maintain their precarious position. The shadow of the Roman eagle was long, and it stretched across the Mediterranean, from the shores of Italy to the fertile lands of Egypt. The archaeological evidence, though still nascent, suggested a burial of importance. The scale of the octagon, its construction, pointed to an individual of significant status. Could this be a forgotten scion of the Ptolemaic line, a casualty of the internecine warfare that characterized their final decades? Or perhaps a loyal retainer, a victim of the same political tides that swept away queens and kings? The disarticulation of the remains might have been a deliberate act by those who wished to erase the individual's identity, to deny them a proper burial and thus a chance at an eternal afterlife, a prospect that held profound significance in ancient cultures. The journey into the past, Eris knew, was rarely a straightforward excavation of facts. It was an immersion into the very human dramas of ambition, love, betrayal, and survival. The bones in the octagon were not merely biological specimens. They were the final, silent witnesses to a life lived within the suffocating embrace of Ptolemaic Egypt's twilight years. And the dismemberment, the misplaced skull, these were not just anomalies, but potent symbols of a dynasty that was itself being systematically dismembered, its power fractured, its identity obscured, all under the unblinking, ever-watchful gaze of Rome. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, flowed on, but the ancient kingdom it sustained was slowly, inexorably being consumed by the rising tide of Roman dominion. The political landscape was a viper's nest, and every whisper of discontent, every ambitious maneuver, every flicker of defiance was amplified by the ever-present threat of Roman legions. This was the world Arsinoe had inhabited, a world of suffocating opulence and constant danger, a world where survival was a daily battle, and where the line between life and death was as thin and sharp as the edge of a Ptolemaic dagger. The discovery in Ephesus, he felt with a growing certainty, was a fragment of that tragic, epic narrative, a silent testament to the violent forces that had reshaped the ancient world. The air in the octagon, though heavy with the scent of ancient dust and the unsettling tang of long-dead bone, seemed to thrum with a new energy. Aristhorn's mind, having grappled with the spectral echoes of a dismembered dynasty, now turned its gaze towards a more recent, yet no less consequential figure from the Ptolemaic twilight, Arsinoe IV. Her story was a whispered counterpoint to the grand pronouncements of her more celebrated sister, Cleopatra VII. Where Cleopatra was a dazzling supernova, Arsinoe, in the early stages of her struggle, was a keen strategist, a player who understood that power was not always seized by overt displays, but often cultivated in the hushed chambers of influence and the subtle manipulation of alliances. She was a woman who refused to be a mere pawn, a queen by birthright who demanded to be recognized as a queen by merit, her ambition a fierce, internal flame that refused to be extinguished by the suffocating traditions of her time. Arsinoe IV, the younger sister of Cleopatra VII, was a woman shaped by the crucible of Ptolemaic court life, a life that was as stifling as it was opulent. The Ptolemaic dynasty, in its final decades, had become a byword for intrigue, a viper's nest where familial bonds were often severed by ambition and where the succession was a perpetual battlefield. Arsinoe, born into this maelstrom, possessed a mind that was both sharp and unusually pragmatic. While her elder sister, Cleopatra, would later be renowned for her charisma and her ability to forge alliances with Roman titans like Caesar and Antony, Arsinoe's early ascendance was marked by a quieter, yet no less potent assertiveness. She observed, she learned, and she strategized, often from the periphery, a deliberate choice that allowed her to assess the shifting loyalties and vulnerabilities of those around her. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, a monarch whose reign was marked by instability and reliance on Roman backing, had left a kingdom teetering on the brink. The internal power struggles were relentless, and the very concept of royal authority was fluid, often dependent on the favor of foreign powers and the success of clandestine machinations. Unlike Cleopatra, who seemed to have been groomed from a young age for a role of prominent leadership, Arsinoe's path was less clearly defined. The traditional roles for Ptolemaic princesses were often limited: marriage alliances, ceremonial duties, and the bearing of heirs. However, Arsinoe harbored a different vision for herself. She saw the inherent weaknesses within the ruling family, the self-destructive tendencies that plagued her siblings, and she recognized that survival, let alone power, required more than just royal blood. It demanded a keen understanding of politics, a willingness to forge her own path, and an unyielding determination to defy the expectations that sought to confine her. Her early life was spent navigating the treacherous currents of the Alexandrian court, a place where one's every word and action was scrutinized, and where betrayal could come from the closest of kin. The air in the royal palace was thick with unspoken rivalries, with the constant jockeying for position and the ever-present threat of exile or worse. For a young woman, even one of royal blood, asserting any form of independent agency was a perilous undertaking. Yet, Arsinoe was not one to accept her lot passively. She possessed an independence of spirit that set her apart. While her sisters might have been content with the gilded cage of courtly life, Arsinoe harbored a restless intelligence, a desire to understand the mechanics of power and to exert her own influence. She understood that the Ptolemaic crown was increasingly a fragile commodity, heavily indebted to Rome and subject to the whims of its Roman patrons. This realization fueled her ambition not merely for personal aggrandizement, but for the preservation of a dynasty that seemed determined to self-destruct. She was a voracious reader, a keen observer of military and political strategy, and she cultivated relationships with those who could offer her insight and counsel, often outside the immediate circle of the royal family, where sycophants and informers were rife. Her male contemporaries, accustomed to viewing women as decorative figures or instruments of dynastic alliance, often underestimated her. They saw her as a younger sister, perhaps destined for a suitable marriage to a foreign potentate or a loyal general. They failed to recognize the sharp intellect behind her often reserved demeanor, the strategic mind that was meticulously charting its own course. Even within her own family, there were likely those who saw her as a lesser threat, a secondary player in the grander drama of Ptolemaic succession. This underestimation, however, proved to be Arsinoe's advantage. It allowed her to operate with a degree of freedom, to gather information, and to forge connections without attracting undue suspicion. She learned to play the game of power, not by shouting the loudest, but by whispering the most effectively, by understanding the leverage points, and by choosing her battles with the precision of a seasoned general. The political landscape of late Ptolemaic Egypt was a testament to the corrosive effects of internal strife and foreign entanglement. The kingdom, once a beacon of Hellenistic culture and economic prosperity, was now a pawn in the larger geopolitical games of Rome. Ptolemy XII's reign had been characterized by his desperate attempts to cling to power, often through lavish bribes and concessions to Roman leaders. His exile and subsequent return to Egypt, facilitated by Roman legions, had underscored the kingdom's precarious dependence. Upon his death, the succession was a complex affair, with Rome keenly observing and subtly influencing the outcome. Cleopatra VII, as the eldest legitimate daughter, was initially designated to rule alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. However, the dynamics of the court, exacerbated by the influence of powerful eunuchs and advisors like Pothinus, quickly shifted. It was in this volatile environment that Arsinoe IV began to assert herself. She was not content to be a mere spectator to her family's struggles. She possessed a fierce protectiveness of her inheritance, of the very idea of an independent Egypt, however diminished its power had become. Her claim to royal authority was not simply inherited, it was a conviction, a burning desire to contribute to the stability and survival of her dynasty, even if it meant challenging the established order. She understood that the court was a place where power was not granted, but taken, and she was prepared to seize her opportunities. Her early gambits were subtle, yet significant. She began to cultivate her own network of loyalists, individuals who saw in her a potential leader, a claimant to the throne who was not beholden to the factionalism that paralyzed her siblings. These were often individuals from the military or the administrative ranks who felt overlooked or disenfranchised by the ruling clique. Arsinoe offered them not just promises of reward, but a vision of a stronger, more unified Egypt, a vision that resonated with a deep-seated patriotism that still flickered in the hearts of many Egyptians. Despite the Hellenistic overlay, she understood the importance of patronage, of rewarding loyalty with position and influence, and she was adept at identifying those who possessed both competence and a genuine commitment to her cause. Her intelligence was not merely academic, it was deeply practical. She possessed an uncanny ability to read people, to discern their motives, and to predict their actions. This allowed her to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue with a remarkable degree of success. While others were caught in the web of deceit and betrayal, Arsinoe often found ways to extricate herself, or even to turn the machinations of her enemies to her own advantage. She learned the art of calculated risk, of knowing when to push and when to hold back, of understanding that sometimes the greatest strength lay in patient observation and the opportune strike. The traditional roles assigned to women in Ptolemaic society, though seemingly restrictive, did not entirely preclude the exercise of influence. Queens, consort, and royal women often wielded considerable power behind the scenes, influencing their husbands, sons, and advisors. Arsinoe, however, sought to transcend these traditional boundaries. She did not wish to be a queen merely by marriage or by the decree of others. She sought to be a queen in her own right, a ruler whose authority was derived from her own capabilities and her own legitimate claim. This was a bold ambition in a world that was still largely patriarchal, and it required a strategic approach that was both unconventional and determined. She was aware of the importance of legitimacy, of projecting an image of royal authority, that was both commanding and compelling. This involved not only asserting her rights, but also demonstrating her fitness to rule. She participated in religious ceremonies, patronized the arts, and made public appearances that projected an image of regal grace and authority. These were not mere formalities. They were carefully orchestrated displays of power, designed to cultivate popular support and to solidify her position in the eyes of the court and the wider populace. She understood that public perception was a crucial element of political power, and she was determined to shape that perception to her advantage. Her relationship with her siblings, particularly Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII, was complex and fraught with rivalry. The dynastic struggle for control of Egypt was a brutal affair, and Arsinoe found herself positioned against her own kin. While Cleopatra was focused on securing her alliance with Julius Caesar, Arsinoe was building her own power base, maneuvering for a position that would allow her to exert influence independent of her more famous sister. This was not born of petty jealousy, but of a profound belief in her own right to a share of power and a desire to see Egypt governed effectively, a task that seemed increasingly elusive given the infighting and the overwhelming Roman influence. One of Arsinoe's most significant early moves was her assertion of an independent claim to the throne, or at least to a significant portion of power. This was a direct challenge to the established order, particularly to the co-rule of Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, which was already destabilized by their own conflicts and the influence of their advisors. Arsinoe understood that in the chaotic environment of Alexandria, opportunities arose from instability. She saw the divisions within the court, the rivalries between different factions, and she skillfully exploited these fissures to her advantage. Her claim was not merely based on her lineage. It was presented as a necessary step to restore order and stability to a kingdom on the brink of collapse. She began to gather support from elements within the military and the nobility who were disillusioned with the current leadership. These were often individuals who felt marginalized by the ascendant factions or who harbored genuine concerns about the future of Egypt under the prevailing chaos. Arsinoe offered them a compelling alternative, a leader with a clear vision, a strong will, and a legitimate claim to the throne. She was not afraid to engage in the often unpleasant realities of political maneuvering. She brokered alliances, made promises, and subtly undermined her rivals, all with the ultimate goal of securing her own position and influence. The story of Arsinoe IV is a compelling illustration of a royal woman's gamble. It was a gamble against deeply entrenched patriarchal structures, against the overwhelming might of Rome, and against the self-destructive tendencies of her own family. She did not possess the legendary beauty or the charismatic allure that would later define her sister, Cleopatra VII. Instead, Arsinoe's strength lay in her sharp intellect, her strategic acumen, and her unyielding determination. She was a woman who understood that power was not always a matter of outward show, but of quiet calculation, of building alliances, and of exploiting the weaknesses of her opponents. Her emergence from the shadows was a testament to her ambition, a burning desire to carve out her own destiny in a world that sought to confine her to the traditional roles of queen consort or pawn. She was a queen who refused to be merely an accessory to power. She intended to be a force in her own right. Her gamble was immense. The stakes were the highest imaginable, and the outcome would determine not only her own fate, but also the future trajectory of a dynasty that was already teetering on the precipice of oblivion. The echo of her struggle, though often overshadowed by the more dramatic narrative of her sister, resonated through the twilight years of Ptolemaic Egypt, a testament to the enduring power of ambition and the defiant spirit of a royal woman determined to seize her own destiny. The grand pronouncements of Cleopatra, echoing with the resonant power of Rome, were meant to solidify her dominion. Yet, in the labyrinthine heart of Alexandria, a different kind of allegiance was silently blooming. While Cleopatra engaged in the intricate dance of diplomacy with Roman titans, seeking their favor and leveraging their might, Arsinoe found herself the unexpected recipient of a devotion that flowed not from the halls of power or the legions of foreign soldiers, but from the very soul of Egypt. It was a loyalty that surprised many, a potent undercurrent that began to swell, threatening to divert the course of history with its unexpected force. This was not a fealty born of strategic calculation or the promise of imperial favor. It was a connection forged in the crucible of shared experience, a recognition of a spirit that seemed to resonate with the indigenous heart of the land. In an era where the Ptolemaic dynasty had become increasingly Hellenized, a thin veneer of Greek culture, and rule over an ancient Egyptian populace, Arsinoe began to embody something more profound. Her defiance, which had initially been perceived as a mere sibling rivalry, was increasingly interpreted by the common people as a stand against the encroaching tide of Roman dominance. Cleopatra, through her very alliance with Caesar and later Antony, was inextricably linked to the foreign power that was steadily absorbing Egypt into its vast empire. Arsinoe, on the other hand, remained a figure within the dynastic struggle, her ambitions perceived not as a capitulation to Rome, but as a fight for an Egypt that was still, in some essential way, its own. The reasons for this burgeoning support were multifaceted, woven from the threads of resentment, hope, and a deep-seated cultural identity. The Egyptian people, though accustomed to foreign rulers for centuries, had a profound connection to their land and its ancient traditions. The Ptolemies, for all their Hellenistic grandeur, had often been seen as outsiders, their courts speaking Greek, their administration largely in a foreign tongue. While Cleopatra, with her intellect and charm, had managed to bridge some of this cultural gap, her reliance on Roman power painted her as an agent of foreign control in the eyes of many. Arsinoe, in contrast, was perceived as a daughter of Egypt, her struggles against her own family framed as a battle for the kingdom's soul, a struggle against the internal rot that had weakened it from within, and more importantly, against the external forces that sought to extinguish its remaining autonomy. There was an undeniable authenticity that seemed to emanate from Arsinoe, or at least from the perception of her by the masses. Unlike the dazzling, almost ethereal Cleopatra, who moved in a world of Roman generals and imperial splendor, Arsinoe's struggles felt more grounded, more relatable. Her battles were fought not in the grand arenas of international politics, but in the brutal realities of internal power plays, where the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. This perceived sincerity, this refusal to be merely a puppet of Roman will, resonated deeply. Whispers began to circulate through the bustling marketplaces, the fertile fields along the Nile, and the crowded quarters of Alexandria. They spoke of Arsinoe not as a foreign-backed contender, but as a true Egyptian queen, one who understood the plight of her people, who felt the weight of their subjugation. Her perceived defiance of Roman influence became a powerful rallying cry. While Cleopatra was a symbol of Egypt's desperate attempt to negotiate its survival through alliance with the world's dominant power, Arsinoe inadvertently became a symbol of resistance against that very power. Her very existence as a claimant, a rival within the Ptolemaic family, offered an alternative narrative to complete Roman domination. For those who longed for a return to a more independent past, who chafed under the economic exploitation and the erosion of their cultural heritage, Arsinoe's struggle offered a flicker of hope. She was not necessarily an active champion of Egyptian nationalism in the modern sense, but her actions, her very ambition to rule, were interpreted through the lens of an ancient people yearning for self-determination. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a chorus of support. It was a loyalty that often bypassed the traditional structures of power. Merchants, artisans, farmers, those who bore the brunt of economic hardship and the indignity of foreign rule, found in Arsinoe a figurehead for their discontent. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles against overwhelming odds. Her willingness to challenge her siblings, to fight for her birthright, was not merely a royal squabble. It was a manifestation of a spirit that refused to be broken. This popular appeal was a force that few had anticipated, and certainly not Cleopatra, who was perhaps too focused on the grand theater of Roman politics to notice the earth shifting beneath her feet. This unexpected wellspring of popular devotion transformed Arsinoe from a secondary player in the Ptolemaic drama into a significant political force. Her power was no longer confined to the machinations of the court or the subtle manipulations of alliances. It now extended to the streets, the villages, and the very heart of the Egyptian populace. This made her a far more dangerous adversary than initially perceived. She possessed a legitimacy that was not solely derived from her royal blood, but from the fervent belief of a significant portion of the population. This was a potent weapon, capable of destabilizing even the most entrenched power structures. The implications of this popular support were profound. It meant that any attempt to sideline or eliminate Arsinoe would not only be a political maneuver, but could also spark widespread unrest. The Egyptian people, in their quiet, persistent way, had chosen their champion. Their loyalty was a tangible asset, providing Arsinoe with a base of support that was independent of, and potentially even antithetical to, Roman interests. This made her a true threat, not just to Cleopatra's claim to the throne, but to the entire Roman-backed order that was being meticulously constructed. Cleopatra, in her dealings with Rome, was playing a dangerous game of appeasement and alliance. She was seeking to preserve what she could of Egypt's sovereignty by aligning with the dominant power. Arsinoe, by contrast, was becoming the embodiment of a different kind of resistance, one that was rooted in the land itself. A defiance that drew strength from the ancient past and a longing for a future free from foreign dominion. This made her a far more complex adversary, one whose influence could not be measured by legions or political treaties alone. Her voice, amplified by the voices of the people, was becoming a resonant echo in the octagon, a challenge to the established narrative, a testament to the enduring power of a people's will and a queen's defiance. The loyalty she commanded was a silent revolution, a stark reminder that power could indeed bloom from the most unexpected soil, and that the will of the people, once awakened, was a force to be reckoned with. This popular support was not something that Arsinoe had necessarily orchestrated from the outset. It was, in many ways, a response to her actions and her perceived character. While Cleopatra was the darling of Caesar, basking in the reflected glory of Roman power, Arsinoe's struggles within the Ptolemaic court, her very positioning as a rival to her more Rome-aligned siblings, cast her in a different light. She was seen as a product of the Egyptian struggle for survival, a queen fighting not for Roman favor, but for her own inheritance, and by extension, for the inheritance of Egypt. This narrative, amplified by word of mouth, by the common grievances of a people long subjected to foreign rule, began to paint Arsinoe as a symbol of authentic Egyptian identity. Consider the imagery that would have circulated. Cleopatra, adorned in Roman fashion, her court speaking Latin and Greek, her alliances forged in the opulent villas of Rome, was a powerful but distant figure. Arsinoe, even if she maintained the outward trappings of Hellenistic royalty, was perceived as being closer to the ground, more entwined with the fate of the Egyptian land and its people. Her very participation in the internal power struggles, her willingness to engage in the often brutal politics of succession, spoke of a ruler who was actively fighting for her kingdom, not merely negotiating its fate from afar with foreign powers. This was a crucial distinction in the eyes of many. Moreover, the Ptolemaic dynasty itself had a complex relationship with the indigenous Egyptian population. While they ruled as Hellenistic monarchs, they also, at times, sought to co-opt and integrate aspects of Egyptian religion and culture to legitimize their rule. Arsinoe, by virtue of her position as a Ptolemaic princess, was part of this broader legacy. However, in the twilight of the dynasty, with Roman influence paramount, any figure who could be perceived as standing against that overwhelming Roman tide would naturally attract those who felt most disenfranchised by it. Arsinoe's defiance, whether intentional or not, positioned her as such a figure. She became a focal point for sentiments that had long simmered beneath the surface of Egyptian society: a longing for self-governance, a resentment of foreign exploitation, and a pride in their ancient heritage. The nature of this popular support would have been diverse. For the priestly class, who often held significant influence and were custodians of ancient traditions, Arsinoe might have represented a bulwark against the further erosion of their influence and the sanctity of their temples. For the agricultural communities, who formed the backbone of Egypt's economy, any ruler perceived as being more attuned to their needs and less beholden to foreign economic interests would have been a welcome alternative. For the urban populations of Alexandria, who experienced the direct impact of both internal conflict and Roman presence, Arsinoe's struggle offered a tangible alternative to the existing instability and foreign control. This support also translated into a tangible political advantage for Arsinoe. A ruler with a loyal populace had a source of manpower, of information, and of passive resistance that could be incredibly valuable. While Cleopatra courted the favor of Roman legions and generals, Arsinoe could potentially tap into a reservoir of popular will that could disrupt Roman plans, provide sanctuary, or offer crucial intelligence. This made her a far more dangerous and unpredictable adversary. She was not just a rival for the throne. She was the embodiment of a nascent resistance, a symbol that could galvanize opposition to the prevailing order. The Roman perspective on this would have been complex. They were primarily concerned with stability and control. If Arsinoe's popularity threatened to destabilize the region or undermine their strategic interests, she would become a target. However, if her presence as a rival to Cleopatra could be exploited to their advantage, perhaps by forcing Cleopatra to make further concessions or by creating a divide and conquer scenario, they might have initially tolerated her. Yet, the growing evidence of her genuine popular support would have made her a more significant factor, a variable that could not be easily dismissed. Arsinoe's defiance, therefore, was not merely a personal ambition played out on the dynastic stage. It had inadvertently tapped into a deeper wellspring of sentiment within Egypt. She became more than just a sister, more than a political rival. She became a banner under which those who felt marginalized and subjugated could rally. This transformation elevated her from a figure of internal Ptolemaic conflict to a genuine threat to the established order, a threat that extended beyond the confines of Alexandria and into the very fabric of Roman influence in the region. Her voice, once a whisper in the shadows, was now amplified by the murmurs of a people yearning for their own destiny, a testament to the unpredictable currents of history and the enduring power of popular will in the face of imperial ambition. The air in Alexandria, usually alive with the cacophony of a thriving port city, had curdled with a palpable tension. It was a city accustomed to the ebb and flow of empires, to the swagger of foreign conquerors and the whispers of courtiers. But this time, the tremor in its foundations was different. It was the rumble of approaching legions, the chillingly methodical advance of Julius Caesar, the architect of Rome's meteoric rise. For Cleopatra, the presence of Caesar was a double-edged sword, a validation of her power, a shield against her rivals, yet also a constant reminder of Egypt's increasingly precarious position. But for Arsinoe, it was an enemy at the gates, a tangible threat to the very soul of the kingdom she, in her own way, had come to embody. The Octagon, the famed palace complex of Alexandria, which had so recently echoed with Cleopatra's pronouncements and the machinations of Roman diplomacy, now buzzed with a different kind of urgency. It was here, within these opulent walls, that had witnessed centuries of Ptolemaic rule and Hellenistic grandeur, that the inevitable clash of destinies was being forged. While Cleopatra found herself entangled in the delicate dance of alliance with Caesar, a dance that required compromise and a strategic surrender of sovereignty, Arsinoe's path diverged sharply. She was not seeking Caesar's favor. She was preparing to meet him on the battlefield. The whispers that had once spoken of her defiance now solidified into a call to arms, a rallying cry for a people who saw in her their last hope against the encroaching shadow of Roman dominance. The siege was not a sudden eruption. It was the grim culmination of weeks, perhaps months, of simmering conflict. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria was ostensibly to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. But his presence and the subsequent Roman intervention quickly escalated the situation from a dynastic quarrel into a full-blown war for control of Egypt. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, had thrown her lot in with Caesar, seeing him as the key to securing her throne and, by extension, safeguarding what remained of Egypt's autonomy. But this alliance, so crucial for her political survival, inadvertently cast her as a Roman puppet in the eyes of many Egyptians, including, it seemed, her own sister. Arsinoe, however, saw not an opportunity for negotiation, but a stark choice: capitulate to Roman might and watch Egypt become another province, or resist, even against impossible odds. And so, while Caesar's legions began to encircle the city, tightening their grip with unnerving efficiency, Arsinoe began to gather her own forces. These were not the disciplined, battle-hardened Roman cohorts, nor the polished Ptolemaic forces that had served Hellenistic kings for generations. These were the men and women who had come to see Arsinoe not merely as a claimant to the throne, but as a symbol of resistance, a fierce embodiment of Egyptian defiance. They were farmers whose lands were taxed into poverty, artisans whose livelihoods were threatened by foreign competition, priests who feared the erosion of ancient traditions, and ordinary citizens who felt the sting of foreign occupation in every aspect of their lives. Their loyalty to Arsinoe was not forged in barracks or sworn on legionary standards. It was a fierce, almost desperate, devotion born from a shared sense of grievance and a burning desire to reclaim their identity. The city itself became a battleground, its once majestic streets transformed into scenes of brutal urban warfare. The Alexandrian populace, galvanized by Arsinoe's presence and her unwavering resolve, proved to be formidable defenders. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very way of life, and this deep-seated attachment lent them a ferocity that even the seasoned Roman soldiers found unnerving. Arsinoe, moving among them, not as a distant monarch but as a comrade in arms, inspired a courage that transcended fear. Her presence on the ramparts, her voice, though perhaps not as melodious as her sister's, ringing with conviction as she urged her troops forward, was a potent symbol. She was not just a Ptolemaic princess, she was a warrior queen, leading her people against the greatest military power the world had ever known. The psychological aspect of the siege cannot be overstated. For Caesar, this was not just another campaign, it was Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city of legendary wealth and intellectual prowess. To be held at bay by an Egyptian queen and her motley but determined forces was a blow to his unblemished reputation. He had expected a swift victory, a display of Roman superiority that would solidify his position and ensure Cleopatra's undisputed rule. Instead, he found himself embroiled in a protracted and brutal struggle, a testament to the tenacity of his adversaries and the unforeseen depth of their commitment. Arsinoe, in turn, found herself at the heart of a maelstrom. Her every decision weighed against the lives of her people and the fate of her kingdom. The initial popular support had coalesced into a formidable fighting force, but the sheer might of Caesar's legions was an ever-present threat. The fighting was relentless, a grinding war of attrition that saw streets scarred by catapult fire, ancient buildings reduced to rubble, and the once clear waters of the harbor stained with the blood of the fallen. Yet, through it all, Arsinoe's resolve did not waver. She understood the stakes better than anyone. This was not just about securing a throne, it was about preserving a legacy, about preventing Egypt from being swallowed whole by the insatiable maw of Rome. The Alexandrian populace, in their desperate defense, often employed tactics that were as ingenious as they were brutal. They used the city's labyrinthine streets to their advantage, setting ambushes and employing guerrilla tactics that frustrated the more rigid Roman formations. The famous Pharos Lighthouse, a wonder of the ancient world, became a strategic point, its immense height offering a vantage point for observation and, at times, a platform for desperate sallies against the Roman ships that attempted to blockade the harbor. The library, the repository of so much knowledge, became a scene of desperate defense, its precious scrolls, perhaps, being used to fuel fires against the invaders, a tragic irony that underscored the desperation of the hour. Caesar, renowned for his strategic brilliance, found himself facing a foe who was fighting with a ferocity born not of discipline, but of desperation and a profound love for their land. He had expected to be welcomed as a liberator by Cleopatra, and a swift end to the internal squabble. Instead, he was confronted by a unified opposition, a testament to Arsinoe's unexpected influence. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to overcoming armies, found themselves struggling against a populace that seemed to emerge from every alleyway, every rooftop, every shadowed corner of the city. The fighting reached a fever pitch around the royal palace and the harbor. The Romans, seeking to secure their control of the port and cut off any potential reinforcements or supplies for the city, launched a series of assaults. Arsinoe, anticipating their moves, had fortified key positions and personally rallied her troops in the face of overwhelming odds. Accounts speak of her riding amongst the defenders, her armor gleaming, her voice a beacon of defiance amidst the roar of battle. She was not merely a figurehead, she was actively involved in the command and control of her forces, her strategic decisions, though born of necessity and courage rather than formal military training, proving remarkably effective at times. There was a particular engagement, a desperate push by Caesar's forces to seize control of a crucial stretch of the harbor. The Romans, confident in their superior training and equipment, advanced with their characteristic precision, but Arsinoe had foreseen this. She had positioned a contingent of her most determined fighters on the waterfront, their backs to the sea, their spirits inflamed by her presence. The ensuing melee was a brutal affair, a chaotic clash of bronze against steel, of desperate courage against disciplined might. The Egyptians fought with a ferocity that surprised even Caesar's veterans, their every action fueled by the knowledge that defeat meant the end of their independence. In the heart of this maelstrom, Arsinoe proved herself to be a leader of unexpected caliber. She was not afraid to be at the forefront of the danger, her very presence a galvanizing force. She understood the minds of her soldiers, their hopes and their fears. She knew that words of grand strategy would mean little to a farmer wielding a sharpened scythe against a legionary's gladius. Instead, she spoke of their homes, their families, their ancient heritage. She reminded them what they were fighting for, and in doing so, she ignited a fire that burned brighter than any Roman torch. The fighting was so fierce, so desperate, that at one point, Caesar's own contingent found themselves cornered, their escape routes choked off by the furious Alexandrian defenders. It was a moment of extreme peril for the Roman commander. For a fleeting, heart-stopping period, it seemed as though the seemingly invincible Julius Caesar might be captured, or worse, killed, on the very soil of Egypt. This would have been an event of unprecedented magnitude, a turning point that could have irrevocably altered the course of Roman and world history. The narrative of the siege is filled with moments where Arsinoe's influence was palpable. It wasn't just the organized defense of fortified positions, it was the spirit that pervaded the city. The very streets seemed to conspire against the Romans. Buildings that should have been strategic assets for the invaders became traps. The familiar cityscape, so beloved by its inhabitants, transformed into a deadly maze for the foreign soldiers. This was a testament to the deep connection Arsinoe had forged with her people, a bond that allowed her to harness their collective will and turn it into a formidable weapon. The Roman chroniclers, even while undoubtedly biased, could not entirely suppress the impact of Arsinoe's leadership. They speak of her defiance, of her refusal to yield, of the devotion she inspired in her troops. While they might have framed her as a rebellious usurper, a tool of political intrigue, they could not deny the effectiveness of her command, the ferocity of the soldiers who fought under her banner, or the precarious position she forced Caesar into. The siege was a crucible, forging Arsinoe into a figure of legend. She had stepped onto the world stage not as a pawn in a game of Roman power, but as a sovereign ruler willing to fight for her kingdom. The chaos, the courage, the sheer terror of the battlefield were her constant companions. She witnessed firsthand the cost of war, the sacrifice of her people, the brutal reality of a struggle for survival. And through it all, she stood firm, a bulwark against the storm. The desperation of the situation was mirrored in the choices made by both sides. Caesar, facing unexpected resistance, resorted to increasingly drastic measures. He ordered the burning of ships in the harbor to prevent them from falling into Egyptian hands, a decision that, tragically, led to the accidental destruction of a significant portion of the Great Library of Alexandria. This act of destruction, born out of military necessity, has echoed through history as a symbol of the devastating consequences of conflict, a grim reminder of what is lost when civilizations clash. Arsinoe, on the other hand, was forced to adapt and innovate. Her forces, though brave, were outmatched in terms of military experience and equipment. She had to rely on the terrain, the loyalty of her people, and her own innate understanding of leadership to counter Caesar's tactical genius. She moved her command post strategically, ensuring she was visible to her troops, a constant source of inspiration and a living embodiment of their resistance. The fighting was not confined to pitched battles. It was a continuous grueling struggle for control of key areas within the city. Every street corner, every alleyway, every rooftop became a potential battlefield. The Alexandrians, with Arsinoe's leadership, effectively turned their city into a fortress, a testament to their determination to repel the foreign invader. They fought with a ferocity born from the deep-seated belief that they were defending not just their homes, but their very identity as a people. The narrative of this siege is one of immense bravery and a near miraculous display of resistance. Arsinoe, by leading her forces against Caesar himself, had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just a political rival, she was a military adversary of the highest order. Her actions during the siege of Alexandria were a defining moment, a testament to her courage and her ability to inspire unwavering loyalty in the face of overwhelming odds. She pushed Caesar's forces to the brink, demonstrating that even the most powerful empire could be challenged by a determined people fighting for their freedom, their sovereignty, and their queen. The echo of her defiance, born in the heart of the octagon, now roared through the burning streets of Alexandria, a powerful testament to the enduring spirit of resistance. Caesar, the master strategist, understood the battlefield extended far beyond the blood-soaked cobblestones of Alexandria. Victory was not merely the silencing of enemy swords, but the subjugation of their spirits. With Arsinoe's forces finally broken, her desperate gamble having faltered against the inexorable might of Roman steel, the question became not if she would be apprehended, but how her capture would be leveraged. To simply execute her would be to risk turning her into a martyr, a potent symbol for any future dissent that might fester in the fertile ground of Egyptian discontent. Instead, Caesar opted for a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated performance of power designed to extinguish any flicker of hope, to demonstrate unequivocally that Rome's reach was absolute and its dominion irreversible. The order was given, not in hushed tones of vengeance, but with the clear, decisive voice of a conqueror solidifying his gains. Arsinoe, the queen who had dared to defy him, who had rallied her people with a ferocity that had surprised and even unnerved the legions, was to be taken, not as a prisoner of war to be summarily dealt with, but as a trophy. The chains were not the rough iron of common criminals, but gilded, polished, and deliberately ostentatious, designed to draw the eye, to emphasize the stark contrast between her former regality and her present subjugation. They were a symbol, not of her inherent worthlessness, but of the overwhelming power that had brought her low. The procession through Alexandria was a calculated humiliation. The very city that had roared with defiance at Caesar's approach, that had seen its inhabitants fight with a ferocity born of deep-seated loyalty to Arsinoe, was now forced to witness her degradation. She was led, not on a chariot, but on foot, her once proud bearing bowed, her eyes, accustomed to surveying her kingdom, now downcast. The silence of the crowd was more damning than any jeer. It was a silence of shock, of disbelief, and perhaps a dawning, terrifying realization of the futility of further resistance. Every Roman legionary, every auxiliary soldier, every merchant or craftsman who had perhaps harbored a secret hope for Egyptian independence was made to see the ultimate fate of defiance. This public display was a stark warning etched onto the collective consciousness of the conquered. It wasn't enough to defeat an army. Rome had to break the will of a people. Arsinoe, in her chains, was the living embodiment of that broken will. Her story, once a narrative of courageous resistance, was to be rewritten by Caesar's narrative of overwhelming Roman supremacy. The people of Alexandria, and indeed all of Egypt, were to understand that even the most determined queen, even a people fighting for their very soul, were ultimately subject to the will of Rome. But the ultimate purpose of this calculated mercy, this display of Roman might through the subjugation of a captured royal, was not to be enacted on Egyptian soil alone. Caesar, ever the showman of his own power, understood the vast psychological impact of parading such a captive through the very heart of the empire he commanded. The journey from Alexandria to Rome was not a swift transit, but a deliberate, drawn-out affair designed to allow the news of Arsinoe's capture and impending humiliation to precede her. Messengers, bearing dispatches filled with Caesar's triumphant accounts, would have traveled ahead, painting a vivid picture of his victory and the symbolic subjugation of the Egyptian queen. Imagine the whispers that would have rippled through the Roman forum, the taverns, the homes of the senatorial elite. The stories of the exotic Egyptian queen, the shrewd politician, the woman who had dared to stand against the invincible Caesar. Now, these whispers would turn to tales of her downfall, her capture, and the ultimate triumph of Roman arms. The narrative was being carefully constructed, a testament to Caesar's genius, not just on the battlefield, but in the manipulation of public perception. The triumphal procession in Rome, a spectacle reserved for Rome's greatest military heroes, was where Arsinoe's fate would be sealed in the eyes of the world. It was a deliberate choice by Caesar to integrate her subjugation into the grand narrative of Roman expansion. She was not to be hidden away, a mere footnote in his campaign, but to be displayed as a prime exhibit of Roman dominance. This was more than personal vengeance. It was an act of statecraft, a declaration to all existing and potential rivals that Rome, and by extension its most powerful general, was an unstoppable force. The chains, therefore, were not merely shackles of iron, but also shackles of narrative. They were designed to bind her, yes, but more importantly, to bind the perception of Rome's power. They were a constant visual reminder that even the most formidable rulers of foreign lands, when they dared to oppose Rome, would ultimately find themselves humbled and paraded as spoils of war. This act of calculated mercy, this decision to spare her life only to subject her to such profound public ignominy, was a far more chilling demonstration of power than any swift execution could have achieved. It was a testament to Caesar's understanding that true conquest lay not just in the physical subjugation of land and people, but in the psychological dismantling of any spirit of resistance, any dream of independent sovereignty. Arsinoe, the defiant queen, was to become a living monument to Rome's absolute authority, her silent, chained presence a roaring testament to Caesar's unassailable power. This was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of calculated subjugation, a masterpiece of political theater designed to underscore the crushing reality of Roman dominance. The gilded chains were a symbol of her fallen status, yes, but more profoundly, they were a testament to Caesar's masterful manipulation of power, a brutal demonstration that his mercy was merely a more sophisticated form of conquest, one that aimed to crush the spirit as effectively as any sword could crush the body. Her humiliation was Rome's triumph, a carefully curated spectacle designed to broadcast its invincibility to the known world. The echoes of her silent suffering would resonate in the halls of power across the Mediterranean, a chilling reminder of the price of defiance against the eagle of Rome. The echoing roar of the Roman crowds had faded, replaced by the desolate sigh of the Aegean wind. The gilded chains, once the instruments of a meticulously orchestrated humiliation, had been removed. Yet, the phantom weight of them still pressed upon Arsinoe's wrists, a constant, chilling reminder of the spectacle she had endured, the ultimate embodiment of Roman dominion. Alexandria had been a stage for her subjugation, Rome the grand theater where her pride had been systematically dismantled. Now, a new chapter, a more insidious form of imprisonment, was about to unfold. Her exile was not to a forgotten corner of the empire, nor to the harsh confines of a provincial prison. Instead, Caesar, in his boundless, often inscrutable, magnanimity, had decreed her destination to be Ephesus. Not just any part of Ephesus, mind you, but the sacred precincts of the Temple of Artemis. The very thought of it, whispered by her Roman escorts with a veneer of respect that felt as cold as the marble they described, was meant to sound like a reprieve, a sanctuary, a place under the divine protection of a goddess revered across the Hellenistic world. Yet, for Arsinoe, it was a gilded cage, far more suffocating than any iron bars. Ephesus. The name itself conjured images of immense wealth, of bustling trade, of a civilization that had flourished long before Rome's shadow fell upon the Mediterranean. And at its heart, the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a colossal edifice, its grandeur intended to inspire awe and devotion. For Arsinoe, it was to be her new reality, a place where her queenly titles would be stripped away, replaced by the somber mantle of a disgraced supplicant. The irony was as sharp as any shard of pottery. She, who had commanded legions and dreamt of reclaiming her throne, was to be confined within the hallowed walls dedicated to a goddess, a divine symbol of feminine power, ironically now her silent warden. The journey itself was a transition from one form of public scrutiny to another, albeit a more subdued one. The Roman legionaries who escorted her, their faces impassive, their loyalty to Caesar unquestioned, were a constant, silent presence. They were not jailers in the traditional sense, but guardians, ensuring that their charge did not stray from the path laid out for her. Their armor, polished to a blinding sheen under the Mediterranean sun, seemed to reflect not just light but the unyielding authority of Rome. Arsinoe traveled with a retinue of attendants provided by her captors, their loyalty more to Caesar's coin than to her lineage. They ministered to her physical needs, ensuring she ate, slept, and was clothed, but their eyes held no spark of recognition for the queen they once served. They were merely functionaries in Rome's grand, theatrical production of her downfall. As the ship approached the coast of Ionia, the air grew thick with the scent of cypress and brine. The coastline, dotted with ancient olive groves and the white gleam of marble, promised a different kind of existence. But as the city of Ephesus came into view, and then the colossal, awe-inspiring structure of the temple, a tremor of unease ran through Arsinoe. The sheer scale of it, the rumored opulence that far surpassed even the royal palaces of Egypt, was intended to dwarf her, to make her feel insignificant against the backdrop of divine and human achievement. The sacred grove, where her exile was to be enacted, was not a barren wilderness. It was a place of meticulously cultivated gardens, of shaded colonnades, of fountains that whispered secrets in the ancient tongue. Statues of Artemis, in her manifold forms, stood sentinel, their stone eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was alive with the hushed chants of priests and priestesses, the scent of incense heavy and cloying. It was a world apart, a pocket of divine authority carved out of the secular realm. And into this world, Arsinoe, the deposed queen, the claimant to a throne usurped by Roman ambition, was to be integrated. Her accommodation was within the temple complex itself, a series of chambers that, while austere, were undeniably comfortable. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, depicting scenes of myth and legend, scenes that now served as a constant, painful reminder of her own fractured narrative. The furnishings were of fine craftsmanship, the silks and linens of the highest quality, yet they felt like the trappings of a funeral, not the comforts of a home. The silence was the most oppressive element. It was not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but a heavy, waiting silence, pregnant with unspoken pronouncements and the weight of ancient rituals. The priests and priestesses of Artemis received her with a practiced blend of reverence and detachment. They acknowledged her presence, their greetings couched in the formal language of sanctuary, but there was no warmth, no empathy in their eyes. They were custodians of the sacred, and she, a living emblem of earthly power brought low, was now under their charge, her fate intertwined with the divine. They ensured she participated in the daily rites, that she observed the fasting and prayer, that she outwardly conformed to the demands of her new, imposed piety. But beneath the veneer of religious observance, a profound melancholy settled upon Arsinoe. The sacred grounds, meant to be a refuge, became a constant, agonizing reminder of everything she had lost. Every gilded column, every intricately carved frieze, every murmur of prayer seemed to whisper of her former glory, of the kingdom she had fought to protect, of the crown that had so briefly adorned her head. She would walk the shaded paths, the sunlight dappling through the ancient trees, and feel the phantom weight of her royal robes, the echoes of her commands, the fierce joy of leading her people. Now, all that remained were ghosts, and the suffocating reality of her gilded confinement. The watchful gaze of Artemis, embodied in the countless statues that populated the grove, was a palpable presence. Arsinoe could feel it, a divine scrutiny that was neither benevolent nor punitive, but simply observant. The goddess was a silent witness to her downfall, a cosmic observer of the ebb and flow of human ambition. Arsinoe found herself speaking to the statues, in the quiet hours of the night, her voice a low, desperate murmur against the rustling leaves. She pleaded not for release, but for understanding, for a sign, for anything to break the suffocating monotony of her existence. The food, though plentiful and prepared with care, tasted like ash in her mouth. The water, drawn from sacred springs, felt like it offered no true solace. She was fed, clothed, and housed, her physical needs met with meticulous attention, but her spirit was starving. The vibrant spirit that had once ignited a rebellion, that had dared to challenge Caesar himself, was slowly being extinguished, starved of agency, of purpose, of hope. She was a queen reduced to a prisoner, a warrior to a supplicant, her every breath a testament to her subjugation, Her days were a carefully prescribed routine. Early morning prayers, followed by a sparse breakfast. Then, hours of quiet contemplation, or perhaps assisting the priestesses with mundane tasks, weaving or tending to the temple gardens. The afternoons were often spent in further prayer or in solitary walks within the designated areas of the grove, always under the watchful, yet distant eyes of her Roman custodians. Evenings brought another communal meal, followed by a period of quiet reflection before retiring to her chambers, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the mournful cry of owls. The world outside the sacred grove continued, oblivious to her silent suffering. She heard snippets of news carried by the attendants or the rare visitor, tales of Roman expansion, of political maneuverings in distant provinces, of the ongoing consolidation of Caesar's power. Each report was a fresh stab, a reminder that the world she had known was irrevocably altered, and that her own aspirations were now mere whispers in the winds of history. She would often sit by the edge of the grove, gazing out at the shimmering expanse of the Aegean Sea. The waves, ceaselessly crashing against the shore, seemed to mock her own stillness, her enforced inertia. They spoke of movement, of journeys, of destinations. She, however, was anchored, a forgotten queen in a divine prison, her future as vast and as empty as the horizon before her. The sanctuary, meant to offer solace, had become a stark monument to her defeat, a constant, poignant reminder that even the most sacred places could become instruments of power, and that Rome's reach, it seemed, extended even to the very heart of the divine. Her exile was a subtle masterpiece of Roman strategy, a more refined form of conquest than brute force, one that aimed to isolate, to diminish, and ultimately to erase the memory of a queen who dared to defy the might of Rome. The sacred grove of Artemis, a place of supposed refuge, had become Arsinoe's most profound and enduring prison. The air in Ephesus, once heavy with the scent of cypress and brine, now carried a different, more ominous perfume, the faint, metallic tang of political expediency. Arsinoe, confined within the hallowed, yet suffocating walls of Artemis's temple, remained a pawn in a game whose rules she had never fully understood, a game played out on a grander stage, with stakes far higher than her own life. She, who had once commanded armies and envisioned a free Egypt, now existed only as a whisper in the corridors of power, a symbol of a past threat that Rome, and increasingly its allies, sought to neutralize. The delicate dance of power in the East had shifted, and the rhythm of her fate was about to change, not by her own will, but by the decree of men who saw her not as a sister, nor a queen, but as a political inconvenience. Cleopatra, the serpent of the Nile, had long been a formidable force, her survival and ascent inextricably linked to her ability to navigate the treacherous currents of Roman ambition. The recent years had seen her forge an alliance, a bond of both passion and pragmatism, with Mark Antony. He, the triumvir, a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap, found himself increasingly drawn to the shrewd intellect and opulent charm of the Egyptian queen. Their union was more than a mere dalliance. It was a strategic imperative, a means for Antony to solidify his influence in the East, and for Cleopatra to secure her dynasty, and perhaps reclaim territories lost to Roman dominion. But alliances, forged in the crucible of power, often demanded sacrifices, and in this intricate web of political maneuvering, Arsinoe, her elder half-sister, was about to become the ultimate offering. Antony, a man accustomed to the blunt force of military might, was also acutely aware of the subtle art of diplomacy, especially when it involved appeasing powerful allies. Cleopatra's influence over him was undeniable, her strategic mind a formidable asset that complemented his own martial prowess. It was a partnership built on mutual advantage, a grand design to reestablish a Hellenistic sphere of influence, albeit one that would undoubtedly bear the indelible mark of Roman dominance. In the eyes of this burgeoning alliance, Cleopatra's Egypt was to be the jewel in Antony's eastern crown, a kingdom secured not just by military might, but by the careful management of internal rivals. And Arsinoe, a legitimate claimant to the Ptolemaic throne, a constant reminder of a divided royal house, represented a persistent instability that Cleopatra could not afford. and that Antony, in his desire to please his paramour and secure his own position, was willing to address. The whispers from Rome, carried on the wings of merchant ships and legionary dispatches, began to coalesce into a more definitive pronouncement. The decision, when it finally arrived, was not born of any personal animosity on Antony's part, nor, it could be argued, from Cleopatra's direct order in a moment of pique. It was a calculated decree, a cold-blooded assessment of political necessity. Arsinoe, a symbol of a previous era of Ptolemaic independence, a potential rallying point for any dissent, had to be removed. Her continued existence, even in exile, posed a subtle threat to the carefully constructed order that Cleopatra and Antony were striving to build. The triumvir, eager to demonstrate his commitment to his Egyptian ally, and perhaps to solidify his own nascent claim to a lasting legacy in the East, found himself issuing a command that would echo through the annals of history with a chilling finality. The decree itself was a masterpiece of Roman legalistic language, cloaked in the veneer of justice, yet steeped in the brutal pragmatism of power politics. It spoke of her past transgressions, her perceived threat to the stability of Egypt, and the necessity of ensuring peace within the Roman sphere of influence. The words were carefully chosen to absolve Antony of any direct malice, framing the decision as an unavoidable consequence of political realities. The order was clear. Arsinoe, the exiled queen, was to be executed. The news, when it reached Ephesus, did not arrive with the fanfare of a triumphant general, but with the quiet, grim efficiency of a courier bearing a death warrant. The Roman guards stationed within the temple precincts, men who had always maintained a professional distance, a stoic adherence to their duty, now seemed to carry an even heavier air about them. Their movements were more deliberate, their gazes more watchful, their presence a tangible manifestation of the imminent doom that hung over Arsinoe. The priests and priestesses, who had treated her with a mixture of religious deference and political detachment, found themselves in an even more unenviable position. Their sacred duties offered little protection against the overarching authority of Roman military power, especially when that power was wielded under the direct influence of a triumvir and in service to a powerful queen. They were custodians of a sanctuary, not arbiters of life and death, and the decree that was about to be enacted within their hallowed grounds was a stark reminder of the limitations of divine protection in the face of earthly ambition. Arsinoe, insulated as she was by the temple walls and her own internal world of contemplation, could sense the shift. The hushed conversations among the attendants, the hurried glances exchanged between the Roman soldiers, the subtle increase in the vigilance of her overseers all pointed towards an impending change, a culmination of forces she had long suspected but dared not fully confront. She had spent years in this gilded cage, her spirit dulled but not extinguished, her mind a repository of memories and a quiet observer of the unfolding geopolitical drama. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her fate was not her own to control. The alliance between Cleopatra and Antony, celebrated in some quarters as a union of great powers, was, for Arsinoe, the architect of her final chapter. It was a testament to the ruthless efficiency of political maneuvering, a stark illustration of how personal relationships, when intertwined with imperial ambitions, could lead to the most devastating consequences. For Cleopatra, securing her hold on Egypt and expanding her influence was paramount. Any potential threat, any living symbol of a past lineage that could challenge her absolute authority, had to be systematically eradicated. And Antony, a man caught between his Roman responsibilities and his burgeoning affections and strategic partnership with the Queen of the Nile, found himself willing to sanction such a ruthless act. The pact between them, ostensibly for the betterment of their respective empires, was revealed in its brutal reality, a cold-blooded decision to eliminate a rival, a sister, a queen, in the name of consolidating power and ensuring their shared dominion. The decree was delivered not to Arsinoe directly, but through the temple hierarchy, a formal notification that her sanctuary was no longer a protection, but merely a holding cell before her final dissolution. The specifics of the execution were left to the discretion of the Roman commander overseeing her confinement, a man whose loyalty lay solely with his superiors and the dictates of the empire. There was no trial, no public spectacle, no chance for defense or appeal. It was to be swift, silent, and final, a discreet tidying up of a political loose end. The once revered Temple of Artemis, a place of supposed divine refuge, was to become the site of a political assassination, a desecration of sacred space by the very powers it was meant to transcend. The news rippled through the temple complex like a stone dropped into still water. The attendants, their faces a mixture of fear and pity, moved with a new urgency, their duties now tinged with the grim awareness of what was to come. The priests, their solemn chants momentarily silenced, conferred in hushed, anxious tones, wrestling with the implications of Roman authority overriding their sacred trust. For Arsinoe, however, the initial shock gave way to a profound, almost unnerving calm. Years of enforced inactivity, of living with the phantom weight of chains and the suffocating silence of exile, had perhaps prepared her for this moment. The fear that had once gripped her had been replaced by a weary acceptance, a recognition that the currents of history, driven by the insatiable hunger for power, had finally swept her towards an inevitable shore. She looked out from the shaded colonnades, her gaze sweeping over the manicured gardens, the gleaming marble statues, the distant, indifferent sea. This place, which had been her prison, was now to be her tomb. The goddess whose protection she had been granted, whose sacred ground she had inhabited, remained a silent observer, her statues impassive, their stone eyes fixed on a world that continued to spin. Unconcerned with the fate of a deposed queen, Arsinoe felt a surge of ancient pride, a flicker of the fire that had once burned so brightly within her. She had been a queen, a sister, a fighter, and though her life was about to be extinguished, her spirit, she knew, would not be entirely vanquished. The pact, sealed in the union of Cleopatra and Antony, was one of ambition and ruthlessness, a testament to their power, but it could not erase the indelible mark of her existence, the legacy of a princess who had dared to challenge the might of Rome and the machinations of her own kin. The silence of the temple was about to be broken, not by a plea for mercy, but by the final, inevitable whisper of her end, a quiet testament to the ultimate cost of political survival. The alliance was solidified, not with a treaty of peace, but with the blood of a rival, a sacrifice laid upon the altar of empire. The air within the sacred precinct of Artemis's temple, usually resonant with the sonorous chants of priests and the soft rustle of devotees' robes, was now thick with a palpable, suffocating dread. It was a silence born not of reverence, but of terror, a stillness that preceded the inevitable storm. Arsinoe, the deposed queen, had been summoned not for a ritualistic purification, but for an appointment with oblivion. Her life, once a vibrant tapestry of ambition and defiance, was now reduced to a single, agonizing thread about to be severed by the cold, sharp blade of political necessity. The pronouncement, delivered with the unfeeling finality of a Roman legionary's command, had stripped the temple of its sanctity, transforming it from a refuge into an execution ground. The steps of the great temple, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet and adorned with votive offerings, were to become the stage for a deed so heinous it would forever stain the memory of Ephesus. The decree, emanating from Alexandria and sealed with the authority of Mark Antony, had stipulated a swift and decisive end to Arsinoe's perceived threat. It was a barbaric culmination of whispers and calculations, a desperate measure to secure Cleopatra's absolute reign and Antony's unwavering alliance. The very ground, consecrated to the goddess of the hunt, of wild nature, and of the moon, was to be defiled by the shedding of royal blood, a blood spilled not in battle, but in a calculated act of political expediency that defied every tenet of divine law and human compassion. As the Roman soldiers, their faces grim and impassive, surrounded Arsinoe, their gleaming armor a stark contrast to the serene beauty of the temple's architecture, a profound sense of violation settled over the holy place. These were not mere guards, they were instruments of a queen's will, the enforcers of a triumvir's decree. Their presence, a brutal reminder that even the most sacred spaces were subject to the iron fist of Roman power and the ruthless dictates of political survival. The priests, their heads bowed, their faces etched with a grief that could not be outwardly expressed, watched as their sanctuary was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Their prayers, meant to invoke divine favor and protection, now felt like hollow echoes in the face of such desecrated power. The execution itself was a stark tableau of the world's harsh realities. Arsinoe, stripped of her regalia, her royal bearing undimmed even in the face of her impending doom, stood defiantly before her executioners. She was a symbol of a bygone era, a testament to a lineage that had once commanded respect and fear, and her end was meant to be a final, brutal declaration of Cleopatra's supremacy. The crowd, a mixture of horrified temple attendants, stoic Roman soldiers, and a few fearful locals drawn by the commotion, bore witness to the unspeakable. The clang of steel against stone, the sharp, ragged gasp that escaped Arsinoe's lips as the blow fell, were sounds that would forever be etched into the very fabric of the temple's history, a dark counterpoint to the divine hymns that had once filled its hallowed halls. The blood, a stark crimson against the pale marble, flowed not as a sacrifice to the gods, but as an offering to the insatiable god of power. It pooled on the steps, soaking into the ancient stones, a testament to the brutal efficiency of Cleopatra's ambition and Antony's complicity. This was not the cleansing blood of ritual, but the staining blood of a political rival, a sister whose very existence had been deemed a threat too great to endure. The sanctity of the Temple of Artemis, a place of ancient veneration, a supposed haven from the world's injustices, had been irrevocably broken. Its hallowed ground was now tainted, forever marked by the ultimate act of desecration. The goddess in whose name this sanctuary stood was, in that moment, a silent, powerless observer to the profanity committed in her name. The aura of peace that had once permeated the temple complex was shattered, replaced by a lingering miasma of dread and moral decay. The sacred precinct, meant to offer solace and divine protection, now served as a chilling monument to the lengths to which human ambition would stoop. The very stones seemed to weep, the air heavy with the unspoken accusations of those who had been forced to witness this abomination. The execution was not merely the end of a life, it was the defilement of a sacred space, a sacrilege that would echo through the ages, a stark reminder that in the brutal theater of power, even the gods could be made to witness the darkest of human deeds. The memory of Arsinoe's final moments, her blood spilled upon the sacred steps, would forever cast a long, dark shadow over the Temple of Artemis, transforming it from a beacon of divinity into a somber emblem of political brutality. The repercussions of this act would ripple far beyond the immediate vicinity of Ephesus. The news, carried on the swift currents of trade and military dispatch, would reach the ears of the Roman Senate, where the carefully constructed facade of Antony's noble intentions would begin to crack. The spectacle of a queen ordering the execution of her own sister within a sacred temple, a blatant disregard for both religious law and familial bonds, would ignite whispers of scandal and unease. While Antony, beholden to Cleopatra and eager to solidify his eastern power base, would likely offer a pragmatic justification, couching the execution in terms of necessary statecraft and the quelling of potential sedition, the act itself would serve as a stark warning to others. It demonstrated a ruthlessness that transcended mere political maneuvering. It was a chilling display of absolute power wielded without conscience. For Cleopatra, the execution was a calculated move, a necessary purge to consolidate her authority. Arsinoe, a legitimate claimant to the Ptolemaic throne, a rallying point for any disgruntled factions within Egypt or among Hellenistic sympathizers, represented a persistent threat to her dynasty. By eliminating her sister, Cleopatra removed a potential rival and sent a clear message to any who might contemplate challenging her rule. No one was safe, not even a member of the royal family, and certainly not within the confines of a sacred sanctuary. This act, however, would come at a cost. While it might have secured her immediate grip on power, it also cemented her reputation as a queen of formidable ambition, a ruler whose decisions were dictated by pragmatic self-interest rather than sentiment or tradition. The divine favor she claimed to wield might, in the eyes of many, be overshadowed by the very human ruthlessness she displayed. Antony, in sanctioning this execution, further entangled himself in the political machinations of Egypt. His alliance with Cleopatra was, by this point, deeply personal and strategically vital. He saw in Egypt a source of immense wealth and a crucial power base in the east, a counterweight to the growing influence of Octavian in the west. By facilitating Cleopatra's desire to eliminate her rival, Antony demonstrated his commitment to their shared vision, a vision that sought to forge a powerful Hellenistic empire under their joint rule, with Roman influence woven through its very fabric. However, this act also exposed him to criticism. Accusations of tyranny, of bowing to the will of a foreign queen, and of profaning a sacred site would inevitably find their way back to Rome, adding fuel to the growing fire of animosity between him and his rival triumvir. The desecration of the Temple of Artemis would not be forgotten. Ancient cultures placed immense importance on the inviolability of sacred spaces, and the violation of such a site, particularly for a political assassination, was a transgression of the highest order. The Ephesians themselves, guardians of this ancient sanctuary, would likely harbor a deep resentment towards the powers that had allowed such a sacrilege to occur. While they were largely powerless to openly defy Roman authority, the memory of Arsinoe's blood staining their holy steps would become a quiet, festering wound, a symbol of their subjugation and the ultimate triumph of brute force over divine reverence. The temple, once a place of awe and spiritual connection, would forever carry the stigma of this brutal act, its magnificence tainted by the shadow of murder. In the grand tapestry of history, Arsinoe's execution within the Temple of Artemis serves as a stark, chilling example of the brutal realities of power. It highlights how political ambition, when unchecked by morality or respect for tradition, can lead to acts of profound barbarism. The narrative of this event is not just about the death of a queen, it is about the violation of a sacred trust, the defilement of a holy place, and the chilling realization that in the pursuit of empire, even the most hallowed grounds can be profaned. The silence that fell upon Ephesus after Arsinoe's final breath was not merely the cessation of life, but the deafening silence of a sacred space screaming in protest, its holiness forever marred by the blood of a deposed queen, a sacrifice laid not to the gods, but to the insatiable demands of power and the relentless march of empire. The serpent's crown, now worn by Cleopatra, was indeed forged in blood, and the lion's chains, cast by Rome, were tightened with this brutal act, binding not only Arsinoe, but also the conscience of the ancient world to a new, darker era. The echoes of Arsinoe's blood on the hallowed steps of Artemis's temple had barely begun to fade, yet the wheels of power were already turning, not to mourn a fallen queen, but to expunge her very existence from the annals of time. This was no mere political expediency. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign of historical amnesia, a chilling testament to the lengths to which a ruler desperate to cement their legacy would go. Cleopatra, having surgically removed a rival, now sought to sever Arsinoe from the very fabric of memory, ensuring that the narrative of Ptolemaic Egypt would henceforth be solely her own. The operation was swift, insidious, and far-reaching. It began with the silent, yet brutal, vandalism of stone. Wherever the chisel had once proudly etched Arsinoe's name, signifying her lineage, her titles, her very presence in the historical landscape, it was now ruthlessly scraped away. Official inscriptions, adorning public buildings, temple dedications, and grand commemorative stelae were systematically altered. A queen's name, once a testament to her power and influence, was reduced to a gouged scar, a phantom limb of a forgotten history. Imagine the scene. Artisans, their faces impassive, working under the stern gaze of soldiers, their hammers and chisels not creating but annihilating. They would meticulously obliterate Arsinoe's cartouches, leaving behind blank spaces or worse, hastily inscribed placeholders that spoke of a continuous, unblemished reign, a reign that was, in fact, a carefully constructed fiction. This was not merely about removing a name, it was about severing a connection, about delegitimizing any claim, however tenuous, that Arsinoe might have held in the collective consciousness. The visual arts suffered a similar fate. Statues were not merely toppled or melted down, a common enough practice in times of upheaval. No, this was more refined, more perverse. Where Arsinoe's likeness had been rendered in bronze or marble, depicting her in regal splendor or engaged in acts of piety, The sculptors were instructed to alter her features, to transform her into a lesser noble, a mere consort, or even to erase her altogether, grafting the head of a more agreeable figure onto her statues. Imagine a magnificent bronze statue, once a proud representation of a powerful woman, now marred by crude alterations, her noble brow reshaped, her regal gaze softened, her identity subsumed into a more malleable image. In some instances, it was more akin to a defacement than a restoration. Her eyes, once perhaps sharp and intelligent, might be chipped away, leaving empty sockets. Her regal robes might be stripped and replaced with the attire of a less significant figure. This was not an act of artistic vandalism. It was a deliberate act of historical revision, a visual lie propagated through the medium of art. The intent was clear: to remove Arsinoe from the pantheon of Ptolemaic rulers, to relegate her to the footnotes of history, or, better yet, to banish her entirely. The carefully cultivated image of Cleopatra's reign, her divinely ordained authority, and her strategic alliance with Mark Antony could not afford the inconvenient presence of a rival claimant, a sister whose very existence served as a potent reminder of the fractured nature of Ptolemaic succession and the ruthlessness of its current occupant. Arsinoe, though physically silenced, represented a potent symbol. She was the ghost of a legitimate claim, a whisper of an alternative past, and in the precarious political landscape of the late Roman Republic, even ghosts could raise armies. Therefore, her contributions, her moments of influence, her very reign as queen, were to be systematically minimized or simply airbrushed from official accounts. Scholars, scribes, and court historians, under immense pressure, were tasked with reinterpreting events, with weaving a narrative that excluded Arsinoe. Documents were rewritten, histories were re-edited, and official pronouncements were altered to present a seamless continuum of power under Cleopatra. Imagine a royal archive, once containing records of Arsinoe's co-rule, her participation in diplomatic missions, or her administrative decrees. Now, these documents would be altered, her name removed, her actions attributed to Cleopatra or a shadowy unnamed council. It was a form of literary assassination, a dismemberment of historical truth. The records of her birth, her marriage, her brief but significant reign, all were subject to this pervasive censorship. It was as if a vast editorial pen was being wielded by an unseen hand, stroking out the inconvenient facts, smoothing over the rough edges of a contested legacy. The propaganda machine, already finely tuned to extol Cleopatra's virtues and magnanimity, now shifted its focus to amplifying her achievements while simultaneously downplaying or ignoring any mention of her sister. Tales of her brilliance, her charm, her strategic acumen were propagated through poetry, plays, and public addresses, but these narratives were meticulously scrubbed of any mention of Arsinoe. If by chance a historical event involved both sisters, the account would be subtly altered. Arsinoe's role would be minimized, her presence rendered inconsequential, or she would be depicted as a passive observer, a mere pawn in Cleopatra's grand design. It was a sophisticated form of gaslighting on a national, even international scale, designed to manipulate perception and control the collective memory. This deliberate act of historical revisionism was not merely about sanitizing the narrative for the sake of a cleaner historical record. It was a strategic maneuver to solidify Cleopatra's own claim to legitimacy and power. By systematically erasing Arsinoe, Cleopatra aimed to present herself as the sole, rightful inheritor of the Ptolemaic legacy, a monarch whose reign was divinely sanctioned and historically unquestioned. Any suggestion of internal dissent, of familial rivalry that might expose the fragility of her power, had to be eliminated. The narrative had to be one of absolute control, of undisputed authority. The very intensity of this erasure campaign was, ironically, a testament to the threat Arsinoe had posed, or perhaps the enduring potential of her memory. The sheer effort and resources dedicated to expunging her name and image from public life suggested a deep-seated fear that her legacy could not be simply outshone, but had to be actively destroyed. It was an admission, albeit an indirect one, that Arsinoe was more than just a deposed rival. She was a force, a symbol, a phantom that continued to haunt the corridors of power. The more vehemently she was erased, the more she, in a perverse way, seemed to exist, her absence a palpable presence in the meticulously constructed narrative of Cleopatra's ascendance. This process was not without its challenges. History, like water, has a way of seeping into cracks and finding its way to the surface. Despite the official pronouncements and the altered inscriptions, the memory of Arsinoe could not be entirely extinguished. Whispers would persist in the marketplaces, tales would be exchanged in hushed tones in private courtyards, and certain loyalists, though silenced by fear, would undoubtedly cling to the true historical record. The erased names and defaced images were not just acts of censorship. They were also markers of resistance, unintended evidence of a history that stubbornly refused to be rewritten. The archaeological record, which would one day unearth the truth from beneath the layers of time, would become a silent witness to this attempted erasure. Future generations of scholars, poring over fragmented inscriptions and damaged statues, would piece together the puzzle, recognizing the deliberate scars as evidence of a purge, not of natural decay. They would see the blank spaces not as oversights, but as deliberate voids, the ghost of a name that once was. The defaced images would tell a story of a power that sought not just to conquer, but to obliterate its opposition from the very records of existence. The campaign to erase Arsinoe was a dark chapter in the history of propaganda and political control. It demonstrated the terrifying power of the state to manipulate the past, to reshape collective memory through censorship and artifice. It was a reminder that history is not merely a passive collection of facts, but a contested battleground, where narratives are crafted, defended, and, at times, brutally rewritten. And in this particular instance, the intensity of the battle waged against Arsinoe's memory only served to underscore her significance, a significance that, despite all efforts, would ultimately endure. A phantom queen haunting the edges of the historical record, a testament to the futility of trying to truly erase a past that refuses to be silenced. The very act of trying to obliterate her spoke volumes, a silent scream against the very narrative Cleopatra was attempting to construct. The stones might be scraped, the images altered, but the truth, like a persistent shadow, would linger, waiting for its moment to reemerge. The phantom Arsinoe, though rendered invisible on public monuments, would continue to exist in the whispered histories and the unanswered questions, a haunting reminder of the brutal realities of power and the enduring, often subversive, power of memory. The silence of the tomb, once a sanctuary of stone and dust, now hummed with a renewed, almost frantic energy. Years had passed since the initial, tantalizing discoveries within the octagon tomb, yet the central enigma remained stubbornly unyielding. The headless skeleton, a stark tableau of violent dismemberment, and the incongruous skull, found separated and reburied, stood as the enduring, spectral testament to Arsinoe's contested legacy. It was a puzzle that refused to be solved, a testament to how even in death a queen's story could be deliberately obscured, her physical remains treated with the same ruthless pragmatism that had characterized her life and demise. The very air around the excavation seemed charged with the unanswered questions, a tangible manifestation of history's persistent refusal to surrender its secrets. This was not merely an academic debate. It was a visceral engagement with the remnants of a life brutally extinguished. The octagon, a marvel of Hellenistic funerary architecture designed to house the elite of Ephesus, had become a stage for a macabre drama played out across millennia. The incongruity of the remains was the most immediate and disturbing aspect. How could a body be found so profoundly separated from its head, only for the skull to be unearthed in a separate, less ceremonious interment? The official narrative, the one that had been painstakingly crafted by the victors of the political struggle, offered a silent, chilling explanation. Arsinoe, defeated and captured by Caesar, had been brought to Tarsus as a prisoner, and it was there, in a public display of subjugation, that she was executed. Her body, according to Plutarch, was then interred with a pretense of respect, a gesture of magnanimity that masked the humiliation. But the octagon offered a different, altogether more disturbing possibility. The primary theory, the one that continued to hold sway amongst many scholars, pointed to the octagon as Arsinoe's final resting place, a secret defiance against the victor's narrative. This hypothesis hinged on a meticulous examination of the skeletal remains themselves. The headless skeleton, found within the sarcophagus, was robust, suggesting a woman of significant stature and, crucially, exhibiting characteristics consistent with the Ptolemaic royal lineage, a broader pelvis, for instance, and a certain bone density. The dismemberment itself, while horrific, could be interpreted not as an act of desecration, but as a desperate attempt to conceal identity, to prevent the undeniable physical evidence from definitively linking the body to the sister of Cleopatra. Imagine the scene: loyalists, working under the shroud of darkness, carrying out a clandestine operation, a final act of devotion to their fallen queen. They would have removed the head, perhaps to present it to Caesar as proof of her demise, or to prevent it from being paraded as a trophy, and then discreetly buried the headless body within a tomb already prepared for a member of the prominent family to which Arsinoe was married. The sarcophagus itself, grand and ornate, spoke of wealth and status, fitting for a queen, yet it was the careful placement of the headless remains within it that screamed of a hurried, desperate act. The separated skull, however, introduced a layer of complexity that gnawed at the edges of this seemingly neat explanation. Found in a separate, smaller burial niche, not within the main sarcophagus but in a kind of secondary repository, it presented a perplexing dichotomy. Was this the head that had been separated? If so, why was it not with the body? The initial thought was that it might be the skull of another individual, an unfortunate coincidence in a bustling necropolis. But the careful, almost reverential placement of the skull in its own distinct burial spot suggested otherwise. It was not a random discard. It was a deliberate interment, almost as if an honored part of the deceased had been preserved and then later rejoined. In a symbolic, if not physical, sense, this led to the development of competing theories, each attempting to reconcile the baffling evidence. One prominent interpretation suggested that the head, initially removed and perhaps presented to Caesar, was later retrieved by Arsinoe's devoted followers and secretly brought to Ephesus. There, in a clandestine ceremony, it was reunited with the headless body, or at least interred in close proximity, a final, desperate attempt to grant Arsinoe a semblance of completeness in death. This theory spoke of a deep-seated loyalty, of a refusal to let Caesar's brutal narrative be the final word. It painted a picture of a secret network of supporters, risking their lives to ensure their queen's memory was treated with dignity, even if it meant defying the victor's decree. The archaeological evidence supporting this theory lay in the relative dating of the burials. While the sarcophagus and its headless occupant were clearly of the period, the secondary interment of the skull, though also ancient, might show subtle differences in deposition, hinting at a later, separate event. The soil samples from the two locations, the sarcophagus and the niche, would be scrutinized for any telltale differences, any variations in sediment that might indicate separate burial events. However, another, more radical theory proposed a reversal of roles. What if the headless skeleton was not Arsinoe at all, but a substitute, a decoy? This idea gained traction when considering the political machinations of the time. Cleopatra, desperate to secure her position and eliminate any perceived threat, might have orchestrated a scenario where Arsinoe was killed, but her body was replaced with that of a loyal servant or a less significant royal figure. The severed head, then, would be the actual head of Arsinoe, which was later brought to Ephesus for reasons yet unknown, perhaps to be interred by sympathetic factions who knew the truth of her fate. This theory, while darker and more complex, was not without its merits. It suggested a level of strategic cunning on the part of Cleopatra that was entirely consistent with her character as portrayed in historical accounts. Imagine the chilling efficiency of such a plan, a queen eliminating her rival not just in life, but in the very records of her death, leaving behind a body that could be misidentified, a narrative that could be manipulated. The archaeological evidence here would be even more critical, requiring meticulous forensic analysis of both the headless skeleton and the skull to determine if they were truly related, or if they represented two separate individuals. DNA analysis, if it could be salvaged from the ancient remains, would be the ultimate arbiter, but the state of preservation in the Ephesian climate was notoriously unforgiving. The very act of re-examining the octagon tomb was an act of defiance against the historical amnesia that had been so meticulously imposed. It was a recognition that the physical evidence, though fragmented and mute, held within it the potential to speak a truth that had been deliberately silenced. The headless skeleton, stripped of its identity by violence, and the separated skull, a relic of a past too dangerous to acknowledge, were not just archaeological curiosities. They were the enduring, tangible remnants of a life that had been deemed too threatening to exist in the official record. The process of archaeological interpretation is a delicate dance between the known and the unknown, a constant negotiation with the biases and limitations of the evidence. In the case of the octagon tomb, the dance was particularly intricate. Each piece of evidence, from the angle of a bone fracture to the composition of the soil, could be spun into a narrative that supported a particular interpretation. The fragments of pottery found within the sarcophagus, the type of mortar used in the secondary burial niche, even the presence or absence of certain grave goods. All these seemingly minor details were marshaled as evidence, each a building block in a larger, often competing, construction of the past. Consider the sarcophagus itself. Its size and grandeur suggested a burial of immense importance. It was undeniably Hellenistic in style, dating to the period in question. But whose sarcophagus was it originally? Was it already in place, awaiting an occupant, or was it specifically commissioned for Arsinoe? If it was already there, it would lend credence to the theory of a secret, perhaps clandestine, burial by loyalists who had to make do with what was available. If it was newly constructed, it spoke of a more organized, perhaps even sanctioned, interment, albeit one where the details were deliberately obscured. The inscriptions, or lack thereof, on the sarcophagus became paramount. While any direct identification of Arsinoe would have been an obvious target for erasure, the absence of any name, or the presence of a deliberately vague inscription, could be interpreted in multiple ways. Was it a deliberate erasure, or was the sarcophagus intended for a prominent but unnamed member of a family, and Arsinoe's body was placed there in a moment of political expediency? Then there were the skeletal remains themselves. The headless skeleton, lying within the sarcophagus, presented a stark visual. Forensic anthropologists would pore over every detail, looking for clues to the individual's age, sex, and health. The signs of violent trauma would be meticulously documented. The clean severance of the cervical vertebrae, for instance, suggesting a swift and professional execution rather than a crude act of murder. But even these findings could be twisted. A clean cut might support the Tarsus execution theory, but it could also suggest a ritualistic beheading employed by those who sought to desecrate her memory. The nature of the wounds, the presence of defensive injuries, or their absence, would be crucial. The fact that the body was headless but otherwise intact within the sarcophagus was a critical piece of the puzzle. It implied a deliberate removal of the head, not a complete dismemberment of the body. The skull, found separately, was a narrative unto itself. Its condition, its position in the niche, the objects found near it, all these were scrutinized. If the skull showed signs of having been handled, of having traveled, perhaps even of having been exposed to the elements, it would support the theory of it being brought from afar. The careful way it was placed in its own small burial spot, possibly with some grave goods, could suggest a desire to provide a dignified resting place, a recognition of its importance. This detail in particular fueled the idea that this was indeed Arsinoe's head, brought to Ephesus by loyalists who had managed to circumvent Caesar's decree. However, if the skull showed signs of damage that were inconsistent with that of the headless skeleton, or if it was found in a context that suggested a much earlier or later interment, it would cast doubt on the entire theory. The archaeological context of the entire octagon complex was also brought to bear. The other burials within the octagon and its surrounding areas were examined for comparative purposes. Were there other instances of fragmented burials? Were there any other individuals interred in a manner that suggested a deliberate separation of body and head? The socio-political structure of Ephesus at the time was also considered. Who were the influential families? To whom was Arsinoe married? Her marriage to the king of Mauritania, Bogud, a Roman ally, provided a potential link to a network of powerful individuals who might have had the means and the motive to orchestrate such a complex burial. Did Bogud's family have connections in Ephesus? Was there a known presence of Ptolemaic sympathizers in the city who would act in Arsinoe's stead? The very act of re-excavating the octagon was a testament to the enduring power of the Arsinoe enigma. It was a challenge to the official narrative, a refusal to accept the convenient silence imposed by Cleopatra and her Roman allies. Each shard of pottery, each fragment of bone, became a potential whisperer of truth, a clue in a grand, ongoing investigation. The conflicting theories, rather than diminishing the significance of the discovery, amplified it. They highlighted the inherent ambiguities of historical evidence and the subjective nature of interpretation. They demonstrated that the past is not a monolithic entity, but a landscape of competing narratives, each vying for dominance. The scholars who returned to the octagon were not merely archaeologists. They were detectives, piecing together clues from a crime scene that had lain undisturbed for centuries. They were historians, attempting to reconstruct a life and death that had been deliberately obscured, and in their meticulous work, they were reawakening a memory that had been buried, a queen whose story refused to be silenced, even by the unyielding bones that lay entombed in the heart of Ephesus. The mystery of the octagon, in its stubborn persistence, served as a potent reminder that history, when stripped of its official pronouncements, often reveals a more complex, more tragic, and ultimately, more human truth. The unanswered questions were not a sign of failure, but of the ongoing vitality of the past. A past that continued to speak to the present through the silent testimony of its most enduring and enigmatic remains. The octagon, with its headless queen and her solitary skull, was a perpetual question mark, a monument to the enduring power of doubt and the relentless pursuit of a truth that had been buried deep, but not entirely extinguished. The stark image of the headless skeleton within the octagon sarcophagus has always been the most potent symbol of Arsinoe's contested legacy. It's a tableau that immediately sparks the imagination, prompting a cascade of questions about identity, violence, and the deliberate erasure of a historical figure. The dominant theory, the one that often anchors discussions about the octagon, posits that this headless occupant is, unequivocally, Arsinoe IV herself. This interpretation, while acknowledging the brutality of her end, seeks to reconcile the physical evidence with the broader historical narrative, albeit with significant caveats. The reasoning behind this hypothesis is rooted in a meticulous examination of the skeletal remains and their context within the tomb. Firstly, the sarcophagus itself. Its dimensions and the surviving fragments of its decoration speak of a burial intended for someone of considerable status, fitting for a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, even one in exile or on the run. The Hellenistic architectural style of the octagon complex, designed for affluent families, provides a broad temporal framework, but the specific periodization of the sarcophagus and its contents, derived from pottery shards and the very construction techniques, places it squarely within the late Ptolemaic and early Roman imperial era, precisely the time frame of Arsinoe's life and death. The skeletal remains within the sarcophagus, once painstakingly analyzed, revealed characteristics that are undeniably consistent with royal lineage. Anthropological assessments pointed to a woman of significant height, with bone structure that suggested a life of privilege, yet also one marked by hardship. The pelvis, for instance, displayed a breadth that aligned with Ptolemaic women, who were often of imposing stature. Crucially, the absence of any signs of significant illness or debilitating chronic conditions beyond the obvious trauma suggests an individual who, in life, was robust and healthy, fitting for a queen who commanded armies and navigated treacherous political waters. The nature of the dismemberment is the most graphic piece of evidence. The cervical vertebrae show a clean, decisive severance, indicating a swift and presumably professional decapitation. This aligns disturbingly well with historical accounts of public executions, where such efficiency was often a deliberate part of the spectacle, a demonstration of power and finality. If this was Arsinoe, then this act occurred not in Ephesus, but elsewhere, perhaps Tarsus, as historical sources like Plutarch suggest. The theory then posits that her loyalists, perhaps acting with remarkable speed and daring, managed to spirit away her body, or what remained of it, from the victor's grasp. The dismemberment in this scenario wasn't the act of her captors, but a strategic measure undertaken by those trying to control the narrative of her death, or perhaps an unintended consequence of a hasty retrieval. Imagine the frantic scene, securing the body of their fallen queen, a headless corpse, from the very clutches of Roman authority. The journey to Ephesus, a city with strong ties to the wider Hellenistic world and potentially sympathetic factions, would have been fraught with peril. Within this framework, the octagon tomb, while grand, might not have been originally intended for Arsinoe. It could have been a pre-existing family tomb, perhaps belonging to a prominent Ephesian family with whom Arsinoe had connections through marriage or political alliance. Her marriage to Bogud, the king of Mauritania, a Roman ally, certainly provided a network of potential conduits and sympathizers across the Mediterranean. In a clandestine operation, her supporters would have had to make do with what was available, a ready-made burial place to circumvent the ignominy of a public grave or a hastily dug pit. The placement of the headless body within the sarcophagus, therefore, would be a testament to their haste and the desperate circumstances. The sarcophagus, a symbol of enduring status, would have been a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the dismembered remains it contained. This theory, therefore, paints Arsinoe as a victim of Roman political power, her final resting place, a desperate attempt by her followers to afford her a semblance of dignity, even if it meant burying her without her head. However, the separate skull complicates this seemingly coherent picture, and this is where the primary theory begins to bifurcate, or even splinter. If the headless skeleton is Arsinoe, then who does the skull belong to? The most straightforward, though still unsettling explanation is that the skull is that of another individual entirely. Perhaps it was a grave robber who, in their haste, disturbed the primary interment, taking the head, or what they believed to be the most valuable part, and leaving the body, only for the skull to be later recovered or reinterred in the vicinity. Or perhaps the skull belonged to someone buried in the octagon complex at a different time, a later intrusive burial that was later disturbed, its contents finding their way into the sarcophagus or the adjacent niche. The Ephesian necropolis was, after all, a sprawling and active burial ground for centuries, and disturbances, whether by tomb robbers, natural seismic activity, or later construction, were not uncommon. Another possibility within this line of reasoning is that the skull is Arsinoe's head, but its separation from the body is due to later disturbance. Imagine the original clandestine burial of the headless body within the sarcophagus. Later, perhaps generations after, tomb robbers or scavengers, drawn by the promise of treasure, break into the octagon. They might have rifled through the sarcophagus, finding only a headless corpse. Disappointed, they might have discarded the skull, or perhaps even removed it for some superstitious or ritualistic purpose, only for it to be later found by those who understood its significance. Or, more disturbingly, in their search for hidden riches, they might have inadvertently dislodged the skull from a more secure but now lost resting place within the sarcophagus itself, leading to its eventual deposition in the smaller niche. The careful, almost reverent placement of the skull in its secondary burial niche could then be interpreted not as a reunion, but as a salvage operation by later individuals who recognized the skull as belonging to someone of importance and decided to grant it a more fitting, albeit still separate, resting place. This interpretation of a disturbed burial, while plausible, still leaves a residue of unease. The precision of the dismemberment, the clear separation of the skull, and its subsequent distinct interment, even if interpreted as a later salvaging, suggest a narrative far more complex than a simple accident of history. The skull, when subjected to forensic analysis, provided clues that fueled further speculation. Its condition, for example, was noted to be slightly different from the headless skeleton, perhaps indicating a different period of exposure, or a different method of preservation, or even its journey. The soil samples from the niche where the skull was found were also analyzed. If these samples revealed different mineral compositions or pollen types compared to the soil within the sarcophagus, it would lend weight to the theory that the skull had a separate origin, or at least a separate period of interment. This could support the idea that the skull was brought from elsewhere, or that it had been separated from the body for a significant period before being interred in the niche. The argument for the headless skeleton being Arsinoe, with the skull belonging to someone else, hinges on the interpretation that the primary interment within the sarcophagus is the most direct evidence of a body that could be Arsinoe, given its physical characteristics and its placement within a tomb of appropriate period and status. The subsequent separation and reinterment of the skull are then seen as secondary events, attributable to historical violence, opportunistic grave robbing, or the passage of time and subsequent disturbances within the necropolis. It's a theory that tries to preserve the historical accounts of Arsinoe's violent end while grounding her physical remains within the octagon. It suggests that history recorded her death, but the vagaries of the ancient world, and indeed the ancient burial practices and disturbances, have rendered her final resting place irrevocably incomplete. This interpretation, while less dramatic than some of the more intricate conspiracy theories, offers a grounded, if still deeply unsettling, conclusion. Arsinoe, the queen, met her end as history dictated, but her physical presence in the octagon is a ghost of a body, a testament to a life violently ended, and a burial that, for reasons lost to time, was never truly whole. The skull, in this reading, becomes an echo, a phantom presence, a stark reminder that even the most carefully constructed historical narratives can be undermined by the fragmented and often enigmatic testimony of the material past. It suggests a final, almost defiant act of obscurity, where even her remains could not be definitively identified as hers, leaving her story perpetually open to question, a queen forever reduced to headless bones and a solitary, spectral skull. The stark image of the headless skeleton within the octagon sarcophagus has always been the most potent symbol of Arsinoe's contested legacy. It's a tableau that immediately sparks the imagination, prompting a cascade of questions about identity, violence, and the deliberate erasure of a historical figure. The dominant theory, the one that often anchors discussions about the octagon, posits that this headless occupant is, unequivocally, Arsinoe IV herself. This interpretation, while acknowledging the brutality of her end, seeks to reconcile the physical evidence with the broader historical narrative, albeit with significant caveats. The reasoning behind this hypothesis is rooted in a meticulous examination of the skeletal remains and their context within the tomb. Firstly, the sarcophagus itself. Its dimensions and the surviving fragments of its decoration speak of a burial intended for someone of considerable status, fitting for a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, even one in exile or on the run. The Hellenistic architectural style of the octagon complex, designed for affluent families, provides a broad temporal framework, but the specific periodization of the sarcophagus and its contents, derived from pottery shards and the very construction techniques, places it squarely within the late Ptolemaic and early Roman imperial era, precisely the time frame of Arsinoe's life and death. The skeletal remains within the sarcophagus, once painstakingly analyzed, revealed characteristics that are undeniably consistent with royal lineage. Anthropological assessments pointed to a woman of significant height, with bone structure that suggested a life of privilege, yet also one marked by hardship. The pelvis, for instance, displayed a breadth that aligned with Ptolemaic women, who were often of imposing stature. Crucially, the absence of any signs of significant illness or debilitating chronic conditions, beyond the obvious trauma, suggests an individual who, in life, was robust and healthy, fitting for a queen who commanded armies and navigated treacherous political waters. The nature of the dismemberment is the most graphic piece of evidence. The cervical vertebrae show a clean, decisive severance, indicating a swift and presumably professional decapitation. This aligns disturbingly well with historical accounts of public executions, where such efficiency was often a deliberate part of the spectacle, a demonstration of power and finality. If this was Arsinoe, then this act occurred not in Ephesus but elsewhere, perhaps Tarsus, as historical sources like Plutarch suggest. The theory then posits that her loyalists, perhaps acting with remarkable speed and daring, managed to spirit away her body, or what remained of it, from the victor's grasp. The dismemberment in this scenario wasn't the act of her captors, but a strategic measure undertaken by those trying to control the narrative of her death, or perhaps an unintended consequence of a hasty retrieval. Imagine the frantic scene, securing the body of their fallen queen, a headless corpse, from the very clutches of Roman authority. The journey to Ephesus, a city with strong ties to the wider Hellenistic world and potentially sympathetic factions, would have been fraught with peril. Within this framework, the octagon tomb, while grand, might not have been originally intended for Arsinoe. It could have been a pre-existing family tomb, perhaps belonging to a prominent Ephesian family with whom Arsinoe had connections through marriage or political alliance. Her marriage to Bogud, the king of Mauritania, a Roman ally, certainly provided a network of potential conduits and sympathizers across the Mediterranean. In a clandestine operation, her supporters would have had to make do with what was available, a ready-made burial place to circumvent the ignominy of a public grave or a hastily dug pit. The placement of the headless body within the sarcophagus, therefore, would be a testament to their haste and the desperate circumstances. The sarcophagus, a symbol of enduring status, would have been a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the dismembered remains it contained. This theory therefore paints Arsinoe as a victim of Roman political power, her final resting place, a desperate attempt by her followers to afford her a semblance of dignity, even if it meant burying her without her head. However, the separate skull complicates this seemingly coherent picture, and this is where the primary theory begins to bifurcate, or even splinter. If the headless skeleton is Arsinoe, then who does the skull belong to? The most straightforward, though still unsettling, explanation is that the skull is that of another individual entirely. Perhaps it was a grave robber who, in their haste, disturbed the primary interment, taking the head, or what they believed to be the most valuable part, and leaving the body only for the skull to be later recovered or reinterred in the vicinity. Or perhaps the skull belonged to someone buried in the octagon complex at a different time, a later intrusive burial that was later disturbed, its contents finding their way into the sarcophagus or the adjacent niche. The Ephesian necropolis was, after all, a sprawling and active burial ground for centuries, and disturbances, whether by tomb robbers, natural seismic activity, or later construction, were not uncommon. Another possibility within this line of reasoning is that the skull is Arsinoe's head, but its separation from the body is due to later disturbance. Imagine the original clandestine burial of the headless body within the sarcophagus. Later, perhaps generations after, tomb robbers or scavengers, drawn by the promise of treasure, break into the octagon. They might have rifled through the sarcophagus, finding only a headless corpse. Disappointed, they might have discarded the skull, or perhaps even removed it for some superstitious or ritualistic purpose, only for it to be later found by those who understood its significance. Or, more disturbingly, in their search for hidden riches, they might have inadvertently dislodged the skull from a more secure, but now lost, resting place within the sarcophagus itself, leading to its eventual deposition in the smaller niche. The careful, almost reverent placement of the skull in its secondary burial niche could then be interpreted not as a reunion, but as a salvage operation by later individuals who recognized the skull as belonging to someone of importance and decided to grant it a more fitting, albeit still separate, resting place. This interpretation of a disturbed burial, while plausible, still leaves a residue of unease. The precision of the dismemberment, the clear separation of the skull, and its subsequent distinct interment, even if interpreted as a later salvaging, suggest a narrative far more complex than a simple accident of history. The skull, when subjected to forensic analysis, provided clues that fueled further speculation. Its condition, for example, was noted to be slightly different from the headless skeleton, perhaps indicating a different period of exposure, or a different method of preservation, or even its journey. The soil samples from the niche where the skull was found were also analyzed. If these samples revealed different mineral compositions or pollen types compared to the soil within the sarcophagus, it would lend weight to the theory that the skull had a separate origin, or at least a separate period of interment. This could support the idea that the skull was brought from elsewhere, or that it had been separated from the body for a significant period before being interred in the niche. The argument for the headless skeleton being Arsinoe, with the skull belonging to someone else, hinges on the interpretation that the primary interment within the sarcophagus is the most direct evidence of a body that could be Arsinoe, given its physical characteristics and its placement within a tomb of appropriate period and status. The subsequent separation and reinterment of the skull are then seen as secondary events attributable to historical violence, opportunistic grave robbing, or the passage of time and subsequent disturbances within the necropolis. It's a theory that tries to preserve the historical accounts of Arsinoe's violent end while grounding her physical remains within the octagon. It suggests that history recorded her death, but the vagaries of the ancient world, and indeed the ancient burial practices and disturbances, have rendered her final resting place irrevocably incomplete. This interpretation, while less dramatic than some of the more intricate conspiracy theories, offers a grounded, if still deeply unsettling conclusion. Arsinoe, the queen, met her end as history dictated, but her physical presence in the octagon is a ghost of a body, a testament to a life violently ended, and a burial that, for reasons lost to time, was never truly whole. The skull, in this reading, becomes an echo, a phantom presence, a stark reminder that even the most carefully constructed historical narratives can be undermined by the fragmented and often enigmatic testimony of the material past. It suggests a final, almost defiant act of obscurity, where even her remains could not be definitively identified as hers, leaving her story perpetually open to question. A queen forever reduced to headless bones and a solitary spectral skull. Yet, the sheer weight of historical probability, the persistent narrative of Arsinoe's demise, does not entirely satisfy the scholarly or the romantic imagination. What if the dominant theory, the one that places Arsinoe's headless body within the sarcophagus, is fundamentally flawed? What if the sensational narrative has blinded us to a more subtle, perhaps even more poignant truth? This leads us to an alternative, though equally compelling, line of inquiry, one that tentatively suggests that the headless skeleton is not Arsinoe IV. This perspective, while acknowledging the historical trauma associated with Arsinoe, proposes that the primary occupant of the octagon sarcophagus was a woman of considerable standing, yet one whose name has been utterly lost to the sands of time. Consider the possibility that the octagon, and specifically this grand sarcophagus, was intended for an individual who held immense local importance within Ephesus. Ephesus was a city steeped in religious tradition, most famously as the cult center of Artemis. The scale and opulence of the burial suggest an individual of immense wealth and influence, perhaps a high priestess of Artemis, a figure who would have commanded respect and reverence in life, and thus warranted a tomb of significant proportions in death. Such a woman, dedicated to the goddess, might have been adorned with precious grave goods, which, unfortunately, have largely vanished, either through ancient looting or the relentless decay of time. Her physical characteristics, as analyzed from the skeletal remains, would then be interpreted not as markers of Ptolemaic royalty, but as indicative of a privileged Ephesian lineage, perhaps one that had amassed considerable wealth through trade or political maneuvering within the city-state. The breadth of the pelvis, for instance, would simply speak to a robust, well-nourished woman, not necessarily of royal blood. The robustness of her skeletal structure would reflect a life of comfort and care rather than one of active military command or political intrigue. In this scenario, the dismemberment becomes an even more perplexing enigma. If the headless woman is not Arsinoe, then the violent severing of her head takes on a different context. It could still be the result of extreme violence, perhaps a crime of passion, a brutal robbery gone awry, or even a ritualistic act by a sect that sought to desacralize her memory. However, without the overarching historical narrative of Roman political retribution against a Ptolemaic claimant, the explanation for the decapitation becomes more localized, more mysterious. Why would an Ephesian priestess, or a prominent citizen, suffer such a fate? Perhaps her status made her a target for envious rivals, or perhaps she stumbled upon a conspiracy that led to her violent silencing. And then there is the skull. If the headless skeleton is an unknown Ephesian woman, then the skull found in the niche takes on an even greater degree of ambiguity. Could it, in this hypothesis, be Arsinoe's head? The reasoning here would be complex, involving a scenario where Arsinoe, as the dominant historical figure associated with violence and intrigue in the region at that time, had her head taken as a trophy or a macabre souvenir by Roman soldiers, or perhaps by a rival faction. This head, separated from its body, might have been kept by someone who, for whatever reason, perhaps a sense of morbid fascination or a belief in the power of relics, eventually brought it to Ephesus. Then, encountering the grand, vacant tomb of the unknown woman, they might have decided to inter Arsinoe's head in proximity, perhaps with a misguided attempt at reconciliation between disparate historical narratives, or even as an act of desecration by placing the head of a foreign queen in the resting place of a revered local figure. This would explain the separate interment, the careful placement indicating an intentional act, albeit one whose motive remains obscure. Alternatively, the skull could belong to yet another individual altogether. The octagon complex, as a significant burial site, could have witnessed multiple interments over centuries, and subsequent disturbances could have led to the commingling of remains. Imagine generations of disturbances: tomb robbers, seismic shifts, the construction and deconstruction of nearby structures. In such a chaotic environment, it is not inconceivable that a skull from a completely different burial, perhaps from a much later period, could have found its way into the niche, its presence an accidental intrusion, a spectral addition to an already complex archaeological puzzle. The soil analysis here would be crucial, but potentially inconclusive, given the possibility of widespread disturbance and contamination within the necropolis over millennia. This theory, that the primary remains are of an unknown woman and the skull of another, possibly Arsinoe, or even someone else entirely, underscores the fundamental limitations of archaeological interpretation. It highlights that absence of definitive proof, the lack of a clear historical inscription directly linking the remains to a named individual, leaves vast tracts of uncertainty. The octagon tomb, in this light, transforms from a tomb of a known, albeit tragically deceased, queen into a poignant monument to the countless lives that have been lived and lost in Ephesus, their stories erased by the relentless march of time. The sarcophagus becomes a symbol of forgotten grandeur, its occupant a silent testament to the universality of death and the fragility of human memory. The narrative urge shifts from solving the mystery of Arsinoe's end to contemplating the vastness of the unknown, the sheer volume of forgotten individuals whose lives, once vibrant and significant, are now reduced to fragments of bone and the whispers of speculation. It is a humbling perspective, one that reminds us that history, as we reconstruct it, is often a selective narrative, shaped by the voices that were loudest, the events that were most dramatic, and the evidence that, by chance or design, has survived the ravages of antiquity. The octagon, in this interpretation, becomes a repository not just of potential historical figures, but of the collective human experience of mortality, a silent testament to the ephemeral nature of individual identity against the backdrop of eternal history. Theory 3. Deliberate tampering of the bones. The narrative of Arsinoe IV, a Ptolemaic princess caught in the brutal currents of Roman expansion and dynastic struggle, is a tapestry woven with threads of historical record, archaeological inference, and, as we have seen, considerable ambiguity. We have explored theories that attempt to reconcile the fragmented remains within the octagon with the known historical events, ranging from the direct identification of the headless skeleton as Arsinoe to more speculative notions of an unknown occupant and a separate, perhaps royal skull. Yet, as we delve deeper into the labyrinth of possibilities, another, far more Machiavellian interpretation emerges: the deliberate tampering of the evidence itself. This theory posits that the anomalies we observe, the decapitation, the separate skull, are not the result of historical accident, opportunistic desecration, or even a hasty clandestine burial, but rather the product of calculated intervention. It is a theory that casts a long shadow, suggesting that the very act of archaeological discovery might be leading us not to truth, but to a carefully constructed falsehood. This perspective frames the octagon tomb and its enigmatic contents not as a passive repository of the past, but as an active stage for a posthumous political drama. The orchestrators of this drama, according to this theory, were agents of power, entities deeply invested in controlling the narrative surrounding Arsinoe IV and the tumultuous events of the late Hellenistic period. The primary suspects, naturally, would be those who stood to gain the most from her permanent erasure, from the historical consciousness, or at least from the distortion of her legacy, the victors, the ascendant powers. In this context, the Roman leadership, particularly those allied with Cleopatra VII, would be the prime candidates. Cleopatra, having emerged victorious from the civil war against her brother, Ptolemy XIII, and later securing her alliance with Julius Caesar, and subsequently Mark Antony, had every incentive to suppress any symbols of Ptolemaic resistance or legitimacy that might inspire lingering loyalty or dissent among the Egyptian populace. Arsinoe IV, her half-sister, and a rival claimant to the throne, represented a potent rallying point for anti-Roman and anti-Cleopatra sentiment. Her capture and execution, therefore, would have been an event to be managed, its aftermath carefully curated to maximize political advantage and minimize any potential for symbolic resurgence. The theory of deliberate tampering suggests that the Romans, or their proxies acting under their direction, did not simply execute Arsinoe and dispose of her body. Instead, they engaged in a more insidious form of control, a historical assassination that extended beyond the physical realm. The dismemberment of the body and the separation of the skull, in this view, were not acts of barbarity to be hastily concealed, but calculated moves designed to achieve specific political objectives. The primary objective would be to create an irresolvable archaeological enigma, a puzzle that would confound future generations and ultimately obscure Arsinoe's true fate and significance. By leaving behind a headless skeleton and a separate skull, perhaps even a skull that could be plausibly or implausibly attributed to someone else, the perpetrators would ensure that any discovery of her remains would be fraught with uncertainty. This uncertainty would serve to diminish her legend, rendering her less of a martyr and more of a historical footnote, a victim of circumstances whose precise identity and end were forever in dispute. Consider the historical context. Arsinoe IV, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, was a pawn in the Alexandrian War. After Caesar's victory, Ptolemy XIII died, and Caesar appointed Ptolemy XIV as co-ruler with Cleopatra. Arsinoe, however, had been proclaimed queen by the Egyptian army. Her subsequent capture by the Romans and her execution in Tarsus, as recounted by some sources, were politically charged events. If her body was not disposed of in a manner that obliterated her identity, then it presented a potential focal point for dissent. Imagine if a rival faction, perhaps one still loyal to the old Ptolemaic line or resentful of Roman domination and Cleopatra's ascendancy, managed to retrieve her body. Such a retrieval could have led to her being interred with honors, creating a tomb that would serve as a shrine to Egyptian independence. To prevent such a scenario, the Romans might have deliberately created a burial that was deliberately desacralizing, even disturbing. This theory posits that the headless skeleton found in the octagon sarcophagus is, in fact, a meticulously crafted deception. The body within might belong to an individual of stature, chosen specifically for their resemblance to Arsinoe, or perhaps simply a convenient placeholder. The decapitation would then be a deliberate act performed on this stand-in, a brutal spectacle designed to mimic the historical accounts of Arsinoe's violent end. The purpose? To create a tangible, yet ultimately misleading, artifact that would align with the known historical narrative of her death, thereby satisfying the demands of historical verification while simultaneously burying the truth. The true fate of Arsinoe's body, perhaps it was cremated or dissolved, or even buried elsewhere in a manner that left no trace, would remain a closely guarded secret. The octagon, in this scenario, becomes a red herring, a monument to a manufactured memory. The separate skull then takes on an even more sinister significance. If the headless body is a fabrication, then the skull could also be part of this elaborate deception. It might not be Arsinoe's head at all, but the head of yet another individual, perhaps someone whose identity was deliberately obscured to further complicate the archaeological record. Or, in a more chilling variation, the skull could indeed be Arsinoe's, but its separation and subsequent reinterment were orchestrated by the Romans themselves. Imagine the scene. Arsinoe is executed, her head severed as a trophy or a symbol of Roman dominance. This head, perhaps preserved or displayed, becomes a tool of political messaging. Later, to preempt any possibility of her followers claiming her remains or establishing a cult, her head is deliberately placed in a location that is both grand and ambiguously associated with her. The octagon, a prominent burial site, would serve this purpose. The Romans could have placed her head in the niche, an act that, on the surface, might appear as a concession to respect, but which in reality served to fragment her remains and ensure that any discovery would be inherently incomplete and contested. The headless body in the sarcophagus would then be a deliberate counterpoint, a deliberate misdirection, ensuring that no definitive reunification of body and head could ever be achieved. This theory is not merely about the physical manipulation of remains, it is about the deliberate manipulation of historical memory. Power, especially in the ancient world, was often wielded not just through military might and political maneuvering, but through the control of narratives. The victors wrote history, and in writing it, they shaped the perception of the past, present, and future. For Cleopatra and her Roman allies, Arsinoe represented a dangerous legacy, a symbol of Ptolemaic resistance that could potentially reignite flames of discontent. Her death needed to be definitive, final, and, above all, non-provocative. A headless corpse in a grand sarcophagus, coupled with a disassociated skull, creates a scenario of violent end and unresolved mystery. It discourages the veneration of a martyr, and instead fosters confusion and scholarly debate, effectively neutralizing her symbolic power. Furthermore, this theory provides a compelling explanation for the seemingly incongruous elements found within the octagon. The grandeur of the sarcophagus, seemingly at odds with the brutal state of the remains, could have been deliberately chosen to lend an air of authenticity to the deception. A grand tomb would imply a burial of significance, reinforcing the idea that this was indeed a royal interment. The specific periodization of the sarcophagus, fitting within the late Ptolemaic and early Roman imperial era, would also serve to anchor the fabricated burial within the correct historical timeframe, making it more difficult to dismiss as an anomaly. The deliberate placement of the skull in the niche, rather than its haphazard loss, suggests intentionality. If the intent was to obscure, then a meticulously planned, albeit disturbing, arrangement of remains would be far more effective than a simple act of desecration. It's a form of psychological warfare enacted on the very fabric of history. The archaeological evidence, when viewed through this lens, becomes a testament to the cunning of those who sought to control the narrative of Arsinoe's life and death. The careful analysis of bone structure, the examination of the cervical vertebrae, the subtle differences in preservation between the skull and the skeleton, all these become data points that could, in theory, be interpreted as evidence of a staged event. For example, if isotopic analysis of the bones revealed different dietary patterns or origins for the skull and the skeleton, it would strongly support the idea of separate individuals deliberately brought together or separated to create confusion. Or, if radiocarbon dating of the skull and the skeleton yielded slightly different results, indicating a temporal discrepancy of a few decades, this too could be seen as a deliberate insertion of an anachronistic element to muddy the waters. The sheer effort involved in such a deception cannot be underestimated. It would require meticulous planning, access to bodies or the means to create them, and the ability to orchestrate clandestine operations within a Roman-controlled territory. However, the stakes were also incredibly high. Arsinoe represented a legitimate dynastic claim, and her potential to inspire dissent was a tangible threat to Cleopatra's precarious hold on power, particularly in the eyes of a populace deeply attached to their ancient royal lineage. The suppression of such a threat would warrant extraordinary measures. This theory of deliberate tampering transforms the octagon tomb from a site of historical discovery into a battlefield of ancient memory. It compels us to question not only what we find, but why we find it. It forces us to consider the possibility that the archaeological record itself has been actively manipulated, a historical palimpsest where layers of truth and falsehood have been deliberately superimposed. The headless skeleton and the solitary skull are not merely mute witnesses to a violent past. They are active participants in a centuries-old conspiracy designed to silence a queen and control the narrative of her defiance. In this interpretation, the pursuit of historical truth becomes a journey through a maze constructed by the architects of power, a challenge to discern the genuine remnants of the past from the expertly crafted illusions that were meant to obscure them forever. It is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not those that are unsolved, but those that are deliberately created. The unyielding bones, in this light, whisper not just of a brutal end, but of a calculated effort to ensure that the full story of Arsinoe IV would remain forever out of reach, buried beneath layers of intentional obfuscation and political theater. The grand edifice of history is often built upon foundations of deliberate omission and strategic silence. Regimes, in their relentless pursuit of stability and legitimacy, frequently engage in the meticulous curation of memory, seeking to elevate their own narratives while meticulously burying those that challenge their ascendancy. Arsinoe IV, a Ptolemaic princess whose life was tragically intertwined with the tumultuous transition from Hellenistic rule to Roman dominion, stands as a poignant testament to the complex and often paradoxical nature of this historical engineering. Her story, marked by ambition, defiance, and ultimately a brutal demise, has been subjected to the formidable machinery of political memory, a process that, in her case, has yielded an outcome strikingly different from its intended purpose. The very efforts to erase her from the annals of power, to silence her claim and diminish her legacy, have, with a profound and ironic twist, ensured her enduring presence in the ongoing discourse surrounding this pivotal era. The architects of Roman power, particularly those who championed Cleopatra VII's ascendant star, understood the potent force of symbols. Arsinoe, as a rival claimant to the Ptolemaic throne, represented a tangible threat to the carefully constructed legitimacy of Cleopatra's rule, a rule increasingly reliant on Roman patronage. The victor's prerogative, a principle as old as warfare itself, dictates not only the acquisition of territory and resources, but also the dominion over narratives. In this arena, Arsinoe's very existence, her proclaimed queenship by the Egyptian army, and her potential to rally those disaffected by foreign influence or dynastic change, made her a target for more than just physical elimination. Her story needed to be rewritten, or, more effectively, excised altogether. The historical accounts, even those originating from Roman chroniclers, often serve as battlefields where truth is contested and manipulated. The narratives of Caesar's dealings with Egypt, of Cleopatra's rise, and of the ensuing civil wars are replete with silences concerning figures like Arsinoe, silences that speak volumes about the power dynamics at play. The act of deliberate tampering, as the evidence already suggests, represents one extreme of this historical manipulation. The theory of a meticulously staged burial, designed to confound and mislead, suggests a sophisticated, almost theatrical, effort to control the historical record. If this were indeed the case, if the headless skeleton and the disassociated skull within the octagon were a calculated deception, then the irony is amplified tenfold. The perpetrators, in their quest for absolute control, would have inadvertently created the very conditions for Arsinoe's posthumous resurrection. A burial so fraught with ambiguity, so deliberately unsettling, inevitably invites scrutiny, debate, and relentless investigation. The mystery itself becomes the seed of remembrance. Instead of being interred and forgotten, Arsinoe was, in essence, entombed in controversy, a far more enduring form of historical presence than a simple, undisputed burial. The concept of political memory is not merely an academic construct, it is a tangible force that shapes the understanding of the past and, consequently, the present. Regimes attempt to forge a collective memory that aligns with their interests, often by highlighting glorious victories, downplaying embarrassing defeats, and conveniently overlooking inconvenient figures. The Roman Republic, transitioning into the empire, was particularly adept at this. The Pax Romana, the peace it imposed, was often achieved through the suppression of dissent and the subjugation of local narratives. For figures like Arsinoe, who embodied a pre-Roman order and a legitimate Ptolemaic lineage, their memory was an ideological threat. Her death, therefore, was not merely the end of a life, but the attempted suppression of an idea, a lineage, and a potential resurgence. However, history, much like water, has a persistent tendency to find its own course to erode the most carefully constructed dams of censorship and omission. Arsinoe's story, even if deliberately obscured, contained within it the seeds of its own eventual resurgence. Her defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, her claim to the throne, and the brutality of her execution as described by some sources, all contribute to a narrative that is inherently compelling. When this compelling narrative is overlaid with the archaeological enigma of the octagon, a potent cocktail of historical intrigue is created. The absence of definitive answers, the scholarly debates, and the very existence of multiple, competing theories ranging from her direct identification to the possibility of a deliberate deception all serve to keep her name in circulation. Consider the fate of other figures who attempted to resist or defy ascendant powers. Their stories, too, often become sites of historical contention. If a figure is completely erased, with no surviving records or archaeological traces, they effectively cease to exist in historical consciousness. But if their existence, their actions, and their demise are attested, even vaguely, and then an artifact or a site emerges that seems connected, the ensuing ambiguity becomes a powerful engine of remembrance. The more questions there are, the more the figure is discussed, researched, and debated. Arsinoe's silence, in this context, has become her most potent voice. The grandeur of the octagon tomb itself, irrespective of its occupant, adds another layer to this ironic persistence. A tomb of such significance suggests a burial of importance. If the occupant is uncertain, and the circumstances of their death are contested, then the very grandeur of their resting place becomes a beacon, drawing attention to the mystery. A humble, unmarked grave might be truly forgotten. A magnificent sarcophagus, however, entombed within a prominent archaeological site, demands explanation. The Romans, or whoever orchestrated the burial, may have intended to create a deterrent, a site of confusion. Instead, they may have inadvertently created a monument to her very unforgettability. This phenomenon is not unique to Arsinoe. Across history, attempts to suppress or reframe the memory of individuals or events have often led to their eventual rediscovery and reevaluation. The controversy surrounding a figure, the conflicting accounts of their actions, the debates over their intentions, these are all manifestations of memory fighting back against erasure. Arsinoe's story, caught in the maelstrom of Roman conquest and Ptolemaic decline, was a narrative that powerful forces sought to control. They could dictate the immediate aftermath of her death. They could influence the chronicles written during their reign, but they could not entirely extinguish the spark of her story, especially when that story was later seemingly resurrected, albeit in a fragmented and perplexing form, by the very act of archaeological discovery. The lingering questions about Arsinoe's fate are precisely what keep her alive in the historical imagination. Was she a victim of ruthless political expediency? Was she a pawn in a larger game played by Caesar and Cleopatra? Was her death a symbolic act intended to consolidate power? And critically, what is the true story behind the dismembered remains in the octagon? These are not merely academic curiosities. They are questions that resonate with the enduring human fascination for tales of power, betrayal, and resilience. The academic pursuit of truth, often through rigorous archaeological and historical analysis, becomes, in Arsinoe's case, a testament to the indomitable nature of memory itself. The irony of remembrance is that the very act of trying to bury a narrative can, in fact, serve to propagate it. By rendering Arsinoe's end ambiguous, by creating a puzzle that has eluded definitive resolution for centuries, her memory has been preserved not as a clear historical record, but as an enduring enigma. This enigma invites continuous re-examination, ensuring that her name will continue to be uttered in lecture halls, debated in scholarly journals, and pondered by those who visit the sites associated with her life and death. Her supposed erasure has become her ultimate, albeit unintended, act of defiance. The unyielding bones, whether hers or those of another, and the whispered truths that surround them, speak not of a vanquished and forgotten queen, but of a figure whose legend was too potent to be silenced, too complex to be easily contained, and too controversial to be truly buried. In the grand theater of history, Arsinoe IV may have been silenced, but through the echoes of her attempted disappearance, she continues to command an audience. The story of her life, and more significantly, the mystery of her death, has become a persistent, indelible whisper in the winds of time, a testament to the fact that some truths, once disturbed, refuse to be entirely laid to rest. The very controversy generated by her life and demise has, in essence, become her enduring monument, a structure built not of stone, but of unanswered questions and persistent debate, a far more resilient edifice than any tomb could ever be. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, consider subscribing. There are many more that have yet to be fully understood.